This is a compilation of over 3 hours of Assassin's Creed history explained, so sit back, relax, and grab your popcorn. Let's kick things off with real-life historical events in Assassin's Creed Explained. The first Assassin's Creed game wasn't set in some made-up fantasy world. It was set during one of the most brutal, well-documented military campaigns in medieval history. And the crazy part is, most players had zero idea just how real the events around them actually were. So today we're breaking down the real history behind Assassin's Creed, starting with the siege that kicked everything off. The Siege of Acre. When you're running across rooftops in the original Assassin's Creed, it's easy to forget that the city beneath you was the site of a 2-year military nightmare. The Siege of Acre ran from 1189 to 1191, and it wasn't some small skirmish. This was a full-scale assault involving armies from England, France, Germany, and beyond, all led by Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France. Thousands of soldiers camped outside those walls for months on end, dying from disease and starvation just as often as from combat. But here's the thing, Acre wasn't just another city. It controlled Mediterranean trade routes and pilgrimage access to Jerusalem. Both sides knew that whoever held Acre held the key to the entire Holy Land. That's why Saladin himself launched repeated attacks on the Crusader encampments, trying to break the siege from the outside. Every single attempt failed. Now, Robert de Sablé, the Templar leader you assassinate in the game, real person. He was actually at the Siege of Acre as Grand Master of the Knights Templar. The game invents the specific circumstances of his death, but it correctly places him at this exact conflict during this exact time period. And the city itself? Historians have actually praised the game's recreation of Crusader-era Acre for its architectural authenticity. The streets, the fortifications, the general layout, they got it right. The Hidden Blade conspiracy wrapped around it is entirely fictional, but the bones of that world are real. If you think that level of historical detail is impressive for the first game in the series, wait until you see what they pulled off in Renaissance Italy. Jack the Ripper. Here's something that should bother you more than it does. Assassin's Creed Syndicate's Jack the Ripper DLC does something no other entry in the franchise has ever attempted. It solves an unsolved case. Every other historical event in these games has a documented outcome. We know Caesar died. We know the Bastille fell. But Jack the Ripper? Nobody knows who he was. Not then, not now. And Ubisoft looked at 135 years of failed investigations and said, "We got this." Let me explain why that's so wild. Between August and November of 1888, 5 women were murdered in the Whitechapel district of London. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. All 5 were found severely mutilated in ways that suggested the killer had surgical or butcher-level anatomical knowledge. Scotland Yard threw everything they had at the case. Modern forensic teams have attempted DNA analysis on preserved evidence. None of it has produced a confirmed identity, a confirmed motive, or a conviction. Zero. Even the primary source material is contested. The infamous From Hell letter, sent to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee alongside half a preserved human kidney, has never been confirmed as genuine. Historians are still arguing about whether the killer actually wrote it or if it was a hoax. The single most famous piece of evidence in the case might be completely fake. But here's where it gets complicated. The Syndicate DLC doesn't just explore the mystery, it resolves it. The game presents the Ripper killings as the work of a conspiracy involving multiple perpetrators rather than a lone individual. That's a bold creative choice, but it directly contradicts the one thing every historian actually agrees on. We don't know. Nobody does. The game imposes narrative closure where over a century of real forensic science found none, and that tension makes this one of the franchise's most fascinating departures from documented history. But speaking of the franchise rewriting what actually happened, the next entry takes creative liberty to an entirely different level. The 1715 Treasure Fleet. On July 31st, 1715, 11 Spanish ships carrying an estimated $400 million worth of silver, gold, and jewels sank in a hurricane off the coast of Florida. The fleet had been at sea for exactly 7 days after leaving Havana. 7 days. And roughly 1,500 sailors went down with it. Here's the thing. If you've played Black Flag, you sailed through the aftermath of this disaster without ever realizing it was the single historical event that made that entire game world possible. Let me explain. Spain had been funneling colonial wealth from Potosi silver mines and Caribbean settlements into massive convoys for decades. The idea was simple: load everything onto one fleet, sail it home together, protect it with numbers. Brilliant strategy, right? Until a hurricane hits and you lose literally everything in a single night. That's not bad luck. That's catastrophic risk management on a scale that's almost hard to believe. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wreck sites became an immediate salvage operation. Spanish workers started pulling treasure off the ocean floor within days. Coins from those wrecks still wash up on Florida beaches today, over 300 years later. But the Spanish weren't the only ones who noticed all that gold sitting on a beach. Just months after the disaster, pirates including Henry Jennings and Charles Vane raided the Spanish salvage camps on the Florida coast and stole approximately 87,500 pounds of already recovered gold and silver. They didn't attack ships. They attacked the recovery operation itself. And that moment is what historians point to as the spark that ignited the golden age of piracy. It proved two things simultaneously. The wealth was real, and Spain couldn't protect it. Every pirate you meet in Black Flag, every ship you board, every treasure you chase exists because of that hurricane and the feeding frenzy that followed. The game never spells it out, but the entire Caribbean pirate era that Edward Kenway lives and flows directly from one fleet sinking on one night in 1715. Reality wrote a better origin story than Ubisoft ever could, but if you think a sunken treasure fleet is dramatic, wait until you see what happened when an entire capital city was swallowed by the earth in a matter of seconds. Cesare Borgia's death. At his peak, Cesare Borgia was one of the most feared men in all of Europe. The illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, he carved out control of central Italy as Duke of Romagna through military conquest and the kind of ruthless political maneuvering that would make modern politicians blush. This wasn't some minor noble playing at power. Niccolò Machiavelli literally based The Prince on this guy. The foundational text of Political Realism, the book that defined how we think about power and leadership for centuries, was inspired by Cesare's methods. So how did this titan of Renaissance politics actually die? Here's where it gets tragic. In Brotherhood, Ezio throws Cesare off the castle walls after Cesare delivers that iconic line, "No man can kill me." It's dramatic, cinematic, and deeply satisfying. But the real story? It's almost the opposite. After his father, Pope Alexander VI, died in 1503, Cesare lost everything. His papal backing vanished overnight, his enemies mobilized, and the man who once controlled central Italy became a fugitive. He ended up fleeing to Navarre in Spain, desperately clinging to whatever military relevance he had left. In 1507, during the Siege of Vienna, a completely unremarkable provincial skirmish, Cesare was dragged from his horse and stabbed to death by soldiers who didn't even know who he was. No recognition, no dramatic last words, no villain monologue, just anonymous violence in a second-rate siege that most history books barely mention. The man who inspired Machiavelli died in total obscurity. And here's the kicker. Modern historians have actually rehabilitated the Borgia family's reputation significantly. Cesare wasn't uniquely evil. He was no more ruthless than any other Renaissance military commander of his era. His villain status owes more to centuries of anti-Borgia propaganda than to documented atrocities. The game gives him a dramatic villain's death he never got, for a level of villainy he arguably never earned. But Cesare's fall from power is nothing compared to what the series did with one of history's most famous pirates. Blackbeard's death. Most people think Blackbeard was one of the most violent pirates in history. He wasn't. His entire career was built on a performance so convincing that it still fools people 300 years later. Here's what actually happened. Edward Teach captured a French slave ship called La Concorde, renamed it the Queen Anne's Revenge, and armed it with over 40 cannons. That single prize turned him from a nobody into the most feared pirate in the Caribbean. One ship. That's all it took. But the cannons weren't really his weapon. Terror was. Blackbeard would light slow-burning fuses and tuck them under his hat so that smoke constantly wreathed his face during battle. He poured gunpowder into his rum and set it on fire just to prove he could drink alongside flames. Every single detail of his appearance was engineered to make you surrender before a fight even started. And it worked. Ships gave up their cargo the moment they saw his flag. No shots fired, no blood spilled. Here's where it gets complicated. Modern historians argue that Blackbeard's actual kill count was likely far lower than his legend suggests. His primary weapon was psychological intimidation, not violence. The terrifying Pirate King was in many ways an actor playing a role. But on November 22, 1718, he finally met someone who wasn't buying the act. Lieutenant Robert Maynard, sent specifically by the governor of Virginia to eliminate him, ambushed Blackbeard's crew off the coast of North Carolina. What followed was one of the most brutal last stands in naval history. Blackbeard took multiple gunshot wounds and over 20 stab wounds before he finally went down. 20 stab wounds. The man literally would not die. And then Maynard did something the game doesn't show you. He cut off Blackbeard's head and hung it from the bow of his ship as a warning to every pirate in the Atlantic. Black Flag depicts the Maynard confrontation and deserves credit for that, but it quietly skips the most visceral detail of the entire event, which is understandable, because the real aftermath wasn't dramatic. It was genuinely gruesome. But if you think Blackbeard's story blurs the line between myth and reality, wait until you see what the next event does with actual documented history. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake, November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day. The most devoutly Catholic city in Europe had its entire population packed into churches that morning, and then the ground started shaking. The earthquake that hit Lisbon wasn't just an earthquake, it was a triple execution. First, the quake itself collapsed buildings across the city, burying thousands of people alive inside the very churches where they were praying. Then came the fires. Lisbon was built with dense wooden structures packed tightly together, and within hours the entire city was burning. And then, because apparently that wasn't enough, a massive tsunami slammed into the harbor and wiped out everyone who had fled to the waterfront for safety. The destruction was almost incomprehensible. Somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 people died in Lisbon alone, and the quake was so powerful it caused damage as far away as Morocco and Spain. This wasn't a local disaster, it was a continental event that leveled one of Europe's wealthiest and most important port cities in a single morning. But here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. The philosophical fallout might have been bigger than the physical destruction. Think about it. An entire population celebrating a holy day, inside churches, doing exactly what God supposedly wanted them to do, and they were killed for it. That contradiction broke something in European thought. Thinkers across the continent started questioning divine providence. If God is good and all-powerful, why did he destroy the people worshipping him? Historians actually mark this earthquake as a turning point in the secularization of European thought, a moment that accelerated Enlightenment debates about natural causation versus divine will. And then Assassin's Creed Rogue does something absolutely audacious with this tragedy. In the game, the protagonist Shay removes a precursor artifact from a vault beneath Lisbon, and that action directly triggers the earthquake. The game makes you responsible for 30,000 deaths. Not a villain, not an enemy, you. It's one of the darkest narrative choices in the entire franchise, turning a real historical catastrophe into interactive guilt that fundamentally changes the protagonist's worldview. If you think that's an uncomfortable use of real history, wait until you see how the series handles one of America's most mythologized moments, Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. Here's something that might ruin your childhood. The version of Paul Revere's ride that you know, the one with the lone patriot galloping through the night screaming about the British, that's a poem, written 85 years after it actually happened, and it got almost everything wrong. Let me explain. On the night of April 18th, 1775, Paul Revere did ride out from Boston to warn colonial militia that British forces were marching toward Lexington and Concord to seize weapons and military supplies. That part is real, and it was critically important. The famous signal from the Old North Church, one lantern if the British marched by land, two if they crossed by sea, gave colonial commanders the intelligence they needed to position their forces correctly. Without that warning, the battles of Lexington and Concord might never have happened the way they did. But here's where the myth falls apart. Revere wasn't some lone hero on a dramatic midnight gallop. He was part of a coordinated network of multiple riders fanning out across Massachusetts, organized by years of groundwork from the Sons of Liberty and local militia committees. The whole operation was a team effort, and Revere himself? He was actually detained by a British patrol during the ride, just stopped, questioned, held. Not exactly the unstoppable patriot of legend. So who invented the legend? Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. His 1860 poem turned Revere into a solo action hero, conveniently leaving out the British detention, the other riders, and basically everything complicated about that night. The poem was written on the eve of the Civil War as deliberate national myth-making, designed to inspire unity, and it worked so well that the myth completely replaced reality. Now Assassin's Creed 3 takes its own liberties. The game has Connor physically fighting off attackers to protect Revere during the ride, which obviously never happened. But there's an unintentional layer of accuracy buried in that fiction. The real ride only succeeded because of a support network working behind the scenes. The game just swapped out organized colonial messengers for an 18th century assassin. Honestly, given how much mythology already surrounded this event before Ubisoft ever touched it, the fictional combat sequences almost feel appropriate. If you think that's a wild rewrite of history, wait until you see how the series handled one of the most explosive acts of protest in American history, the Boston Tea Party. Here's an event that everybody thinks they know, and almost nobody actually does. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a spontaneous act of patriotic rage. It was a carefully organized operation planned over months by the Sons of Liberty, targeting exactly 342 chests of East India Company tea worth roughly £10,000 sterling. And the motivation? It wasn't philosophical. It was economic. Here's the thing nobody mentions in history class. Colonial merchants had built an entire smuggling economy around untaxed tea. It was incredibly profitable. Then the British government gave the East India Company a tax deal that let them undercut those smuggling prices. No taxation without representation became the famous rallying cry, but that came later. The original driver was colonial businessmen watching their profits evaporate overnight. The Boston Tea Party was a calculated act of economic sabotage dressed up in revolutionary language. And about those famous Mohawk Indian disguises? Massively exaggerated. Later accounts turned it into this dramatic symbolic gesture, colonists adopting Native American identity as a statement of American independence from Britain. The reality. Many participants wore no disguise at all. The Native American reference was likely rhetorical flourish, not some carefully planned piece of political theater. History added that detail the same way a game adds a cutscene. Speaking of which, here's the biggest departure Assassin's Creed 3 makes. Nobody died during the Boston Tea Party. 0 casualties. It was a deliberate, disciplined protest. The participants even swept the ship's decks afterward and replaced a padlock they accidentally broke. But in the game, Connor is fighting British guards during the entire sequence, turning a bloodless economic protest into a full combat mission. The real irony. The Tea Party itself didn't unite the colonies. The British response did. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which colonists called the Intolerable Acts, punishing Massachusetts so severely that it drove every other colony to rally behind Boston. The British government's overreaction did more to cause the revolution than the protest ever could. The game added fictional violence. History added fictional nobility. Both are equally creative departures from what actually happened, which is somehow the most interesting part of all. But if the Tea Party got mythologized, wait until you see what happened to one of the most famous conspiracies in Renaissance history, the Pazzi Conspiracy. This one reads like a political thriller, and that's because it literally is. The Pazzi Conspiracy was a multi-year assassination plot involving a rival banking dynasty, a sitting pope, and multiple Italian princes, all coordinated to take down the most powerful family in Florence, and the way it fell apart is almost poetic. Here's the setup. The Pazzi family was the second most powerful banking family in Florence, and they were tired of playing second fiddle to the Medici. Pope Sixtus IV wanted to expand papal territory and weaken Medici influence. So these two forces, along with several Italian nobles, spent years planning a coordinated strike. The goal was simple: assassinate both Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici during a cathedral service on April 26, 1478, then use the chaos to launch a military invasion of Florence and seize control of the city. Giuliano was stabbed 19 times in front of the entire congregation. He died on the cathedral floor. But Lorenzo survived, and that single failure unraveled everything. Here's where it gets interesting. One of the reasons the plan failed is that several conspirators hesitated to commit murder inside a sacred space. They had zero problem planning a political assassination backed by the Pope himself, but actually doing the killing inside a church gave them pause. That moment of piety directly contributed to their failure. History is full of irony, but a conspiracy failing because the assassins were too religious to assassinate properly is genuinely hard to top. Without both brothers dead, the power vacuum never opened. Florence's citizens didn't scatter. They rose up with immediate, violent loyalty to the Medici. The Pazzi family was effectively destroyed, properties confiscated, members exiled or executed. The conspiracy didn't just fail, It backfired so catastrophically that it actually strengthened Medici control over Florence. And here's what makes this entry special, from a gaming perspective. Assassin's Creed 2 is remarkably accurate on the core facts. The conspirators' identities, the cathedral setting, the failure of the assassination, the total political destruction of the Pazzi family. Ubisoft obviously layered Templar conspiracy framing on top of it, but the historical foundation underneath is genuinely faithful to the real events. This is one of those rare cases where the game barely needed to exaggerate, because the real history was already dramatic enough. But if the Pazzi conspiracy feels like a political thriller, the next entry is pure Shakespearean tragedy, and it changed the course of an entire civilization. Julius Caesar's assassination, March 15th, 44 BCE, around 60 senators, 23 stab wounds, the most famous political murder in human history, and it accomplished the exact opposite of everything it was supposed to. Here's what happened. Julius Caesar had accumulated more power than any single Roman had ever held. He'd conquered Gaul, won a civil war against Pompey, and been appointed dictator perpetuo with authority that made the traditional republican system look like a suggestion box nobody checked. A growing number of senators became convinced he was moving towards something Rome never wanted, a king. So around 60 of them decided to do something about it. The conspiracy included Caesar's close friend Brutus and his rival Cassius Longinus, both driven by a messy combination of genuine republican principle, personal grievance, and peer pressure from the other conspirators. They chose the theater of Pompey, they chose the Ides of March, and according to Plutarch, Suetonius, and multiple ancient sources, Caesar had been specifically warned by a soothsayer to beware that exact date. He dismissed it. He walked in anyway. The conspirators surrounded him and stabbed him 23 times. The man who'd conquered half of Europe died on the floor of a theater, and the conspirators genuinely believed they'd saved Rome. They hadn't. Here's where it gets devastating. The assassination didn't restore the Republic, it destroyed it. Caesar's death triggered another civil war. His adopted heir Octavian fought Brutus, fought Cassius, fought Mark Antony, and eventually won everything. Then he established himself as Augustus, the first Roman emperor, creating the exact concentration of power that the senators had murdered Caesar to prevent. Every single one of them killed for nothing. Worse than nothing, they killed for the opposite of what they wanted. A C. Origins frames the assassination as carried out by members of the Hidden Ones, the Proto-Assassin Brotherhood. The game swaps Republican political principle for ancient artifact protection as the motivation, but the bones of the event are historically accurate. The date, the location, the conspirators, the wound count, it's all real. And that's what makes Caesar's assassination unique on this list. No other event in the franchise has this level of documentation. Ancient historians gave us dates, locations, names, and body counts with a precision that most events on this list can't match. This isn't reconstructed from fragments. This is history written in blood by people who were there. But the real reason this closes out the list has nothing to do with the game. It's that single brutal irony. The men who murdered a dictator to save democracy created an empire, and 2,000 years later, we're still talking about how spectacularly they failed. Assassin's Creed replaced real assassins with fictional ones in nearly every historical killing they depicted. And that makes sense for a video game, except there's one assassination where Ubisoft changed literally nothing but the name on the trigger finger. The date matches, the location matches, the method matches, the victim actually died by assassination during that exact battle. That's why today, I'm breaking down the 10 most historically accurate assassinations in Assassin's Creed history, starting with a politician who actually died running away from a fight, Caelion. Caelion the Demagogue died at the Battle of Amphipolis in 422 BCE while running away. And that's not Assassin's Creed fiction, that's documented history written by a man who absolutely hated him. The game depicts this perfectly. You track Cleon to Amphipolis during Chapter 8 of Odyssey, where Sparta and Athens clash in one of the Peloponnesian War's bloodiest battles. Brasidas launches a surprise attack. The Athenian forces collapse. Cleon abandons his troops and flees toward the beach. You chase him down and kill him while he's literally unarmed, making him pathetically easy to defeat. The game frames him as a high-ranking Cult of Cosmos member who orchestrated Pericles' death through plague manipulation. But here's what makes this historically accurate. Cleon actually died at this exact battle, on this exact date, while fleeing. Thucydides documented the whole thing in his History of the Peloponnesian War. Cleon commanded the Athenian forces at Amphipolis. Brasidas, the Spartan general, surprised the Athenians with an aggressive sortie from inside the city. The Athenian line broke immediately. Cleon, according to Thucydides, turned and ran. A Myrcinian Peltast, a Thracian light infantryman, caught him and killed him during the retreat. Thucydides makes it crystal clear that Cleon died a coward's death, not in glorious combat, not defending his men, running away. The game even gets the dual commander deaths right. Brasidas and Cleon both died in the same battle, which almost never happens. Brasidas led a heroic charge and lived long enough to hear about his victory before dying from his wounds. The Amphipolitans buried him in their agora as a founder hero. Cleon got caught fleeing and nobody mourned him. Thucydides had every reason to write this way. Cleon had him exiled for failing to defend Amphipolis years earlier. The history of the Peloponnesian War is partly a revenge piece. Demi calls Cleon the most violent man in Athens and makes sure everyone knows he died like a coward. The only thing Odyssey changes is who killed him. The historical record says a nameless Thracian soldier. The game puts Cassandra or Alexios in that role. Everything else, the date, the location, the circumstances, Cleon fleeing in panic, even the beach setting where players catch him, matches the historical account. That death triggered the Peace of Nicias in 421 BCE. Both sides lost their most aggressive war leaders in one battle, making negotiations possible. But if one cowardly politician dying at the right battle seems accurate, wait until you see the religious reformer who actually burned to death in the exact same plaza the game depicts, Girolamo Savonarola. Girolamo Savonarola was executed in Florence's Piazza della Signoria on May 23, 1498, and the game puts you in that exact square on that exact day watching him burn. Assassin's Creed 2's Bonfire of the Vanities DLC sends Ezio to Florence during Savonarola's theocratic rule. The friar controls the city through religious fervor, burning books and art in massive public bonfires. He uses an apple of Eden to dominate the population. Ezio systematically dismantles his network by assassinating 9 of his lieutenants across Florence. The final confrontation happens in the Piazza della Signoria, where an angry mob captures Savonarola and prepares to burn him alive. Ezio delivers a mercy kill with his hidden blade before the flames reach him, then gives a speech about freedom to the assembled crowd. But the historical execution happened exactly this way, just without Ezio's intervention. Pope Alexander VI excommunicated Savonarola in 1497 for refusing to stop his apocalyptic preaching. Florentine authorities arrested him in April 1498. They tortured him with strappado, repeatedly dropping him from a height with his arms tied behind his back until his shoulders dislocated. Under torture, he confessed to fabricating his divine visions. He was tried for heresy, sedition, and religious errors. On May 23, 1498, guards led Savonarola and 2 followers to a scaffold in the Piazza della Signoria. They were hanged from chains, then burned while their bodies dangled. Officials threw the ashes into the Arno River to prevent relic collection. The game changes the execution method slightly. History records hanging followed by burning. Toward the game shows burning at the stake, which Ezio interrupts. But the location, the date, the public spectacle, the crowd's participation, even the conflict with Pope Alexander VI all match perfectly. Here's the detail most players miss. The Bonfire of the Vanities was real. Savonarola organized multiple public burnings where Florentines destroyed books, art, cosmetics, mirrors, musical instruments, and anything he deemed sinful. Some historians believe works by Botticelli burned in these fires. The game's title references actual historical events, and when Savonarola burned, witnesses reported his hand appeared to move during the fire, seeming to bless the crowd. The heat made his arm contract. People panicked, thinking it was a divine sign. But if watching a religious reformer burn in the right plaza seems accurate, you get to wait until you see the Ottoman prince, who was actually murdered by his own brother, exactly where the game shows it. Shezadi Ahmet. Shezadi Ahmet was murdered by his younger brother in 1513 to secure the Ottoman throne. And Assassin's Creed Revelations does something almost unheard of in the franchise. It keeps the actual killer. The final sequence of Revelations focuses on the Ottoman succession crisis. Ezio recovers the Mesjaf keys, while Prince Ahmet and Prince Selim fight for their father's throne. Ahmet wants the keys to unlock Altair's library and find the Apple of Eden hidden inside. Ezio refuses. A massive chase sequence erupts through Constantinople, culminating in a carriage pursuit and mid-air combat. Ezio and Ahmet crash near a cliff edge outside the city. Selim arrives with the full Ottoman army. He announces, their father Bayezid II has abdicated in his favor. Then he walks up to Ahmet and pushes him off the cliff to his death while Ezio watches. But this actually happened. Selim actually killed his brother. Ottoman succession operated under the law of fratricide, officially codified by Mehmed the Conqueror. The law stated that whichever son inherited the Sultanate should kill his brothers in the interest of world order and preventing civil war. This wasn't murder, this was a legal requirement. Ahmet and Selim fought a civil war from 1509 to 1513. Their father Bayezid II favored Ahmet, the scholarly older son, but the Janissaries backed Selim, the military genius. Selim forced his father to abdicate in April 1512. Ahmet fled and continued resisting for another another year. Selim captured Ahmed in April 1513 and had him executed. In the traditional method was bowstring strangulation, used because it avoided shedding royal blood. Ottoman executioners were specialists at this technique. Then Selim systematically hunted down and killed all 5 of Ahmed's sons, his own nephews, to eliminate rival claims to the throne. The game changes the execution method from strangulation to dramatically pushing him off a cliff, and it moves the death from 1513 to 1512, but everything else is accurate. Selim killed Ahmed. Their father abdicated. The succession crisis was real. Even Ezio's role as a witness makes sense, since the Italian assassins had connections to Constantinople during this period. This is incredibly rare for Assassin's Creed. The franchise almost always changes who commits the killing to insert the protagonist. UE Revelations keeps Selim as the murderer and lets Ezio watch helplessly. It's historically faithful in a way most AC games avoid, but if one brother killing another to follow Ottoman law seems brutal, wait until you see the Caliph who was murdered on the exact date documented in 9th century chronicles, Al-Mutawakkil. Al-Mutawakkil was assassinated on December 11th, 861 CE by his own guards, and Assassin's Creed Mirage puts you there on that exact night watching it happen. The prologue of Mirage takes place in Anbar, the Caliph's winter capital. You play as young Basim, a street thief who breaks into the Winter Palace to steal an Isu artifact. Your childhood friend Nahal accompanies you. The heist goes wrong. Guards discover you in the Caliph's chambers. Nahal panics and kills Al-Mutawakkil to save Basim's life. In this triggers a citywide massacre. The Caliph's forces hunt down every thief in Anbar as revenge. Basim flees to Baghdad, where the main game begins. The entire plot of Mirage stems from this single assassination in the prologue. But this assassination actually happened on this date. Al-Mutawakkil ruled as the 10th Abbasid Caliph from 847 to 861. He persecuted religious minorities, destroyed non-Muslim shrines, and relied heavily on Turkish military commanders who grew to resent him. On the night of December 10th, 861, Turkish guards led by General Wasif al-Turki burst into the Caliph's chambers while he was drinking with his favorite companion, Al-Fath ibn Khakan. They killed Al-Fath first when he tried to protect the Caliph. Then they murdered Al-Mutawakkil. His own son, Al-Muntasir. Imi supported the conspiracy after being publicly humiliated by his father. The game gets the exact date right, December 8th to 61. The location is slightly modified. Mirage uses Anbar instead of Samarra for gameplay reasons, but both were Abbasid capitals and Al-Mutawakkil moved between them. The involvement of Turkish military forces matches historical records. Even the character of Wasif appears in the game as a military leader. The conspiracy, the sudden violent entry into the Caliph's chambers, the political chaos that followed, all of it documented in 9th century chronicles. Historical sources tried to cover it up initially. They claimed Al-Fath murdered the Caliph and was killed in turn. When that story failed, they said Al-Mutawakkil choked on his drink. Neither explanation held. Everyone knew it was assassination. This murder triggered the anarchy at Samarra, a 10-year period where 4 caliphs were violently removed and Turkish commanders became kingmakers. The Abbasid Caliphate never recovered its full authority. Al-Mutawakkil's death marked the beginning of the caliphate's decline into ceremonial irrelevance. But if a caliph dying on the documented date seems impressive, wait until you see the 15-year-old pharaoh who actually drowned in the Nile exactly like the game depicts, Ptolemy XIII. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile River in 47 BCE after losing a battle to Julius Caesar, and Origins depicts his death so accurately that it only adds crocodiles for dramatic effect. Assassin's Creed Origins builds toward the Battle of the Nile throughout its Egyptian campaign. Bayek and Aya work with Cleopatra and Caesar to defeat the young pharaoh's forces. The mission plays out as a massive naval battle on the Nile, with burning ships and chaotic combat. After the battle, Aya pursues Ptolemy's fleeing vessel. She draws her bow with him in her sights, a clean shot, an easy kill. Then she lowers her weapon. She chooses mercy for the 15-year-old boy. Ptolemy tries to escape on a small reed boat. Crocodiles attack, the boat capsizes. He drowns while Aya watches from a distance. But remove the crocodiles, and this is exactly how Ptolemy XIII died. The Battle of the Nile happened in January 47 BCE near Alexandria. Caesar's forces destroyed Ptolemy's army and navy. The young pharaoh fled in panic. Historical sources document him attempting to cross the Nile by boat. The vessel became overloaded with fleeing soldiers and officers. It capsized. Ptolemy XIII drowned on January 13, 47 BCE. He was 15 years old. His body was later identified by his distinctive golden armor, the same ornate armor the game shows him wearing during the battle. Origins captures the method, the circumstances, the time frame, and even Ptolemy's age with remarkable precision. The crocodile attack is the only fictional addition. Everything else, the naval defeat, the desperate flight, the capsized boat, the Nile drowning, matches primary sources written by Roman historians who documented Caesar's Egyptian campaign. Here's the detail that makes this historically fascinating. fascinating. Ptolemy had ordered Pompey the Great beheaded just months earlier, expecting Caesar would be grateful. Instead, Caesar was horrified. Pompey was his son-in-law and former ally. The murder turned Caesar against Ptolemy and secured his support for Cleopatra. That one political miscalculation led directly to the Battle of the Nile and Ptolemy's death. Ancient sources describe Caesar retrieving the body and giving it proper burial as a gesture of respect for Egyptian customs, despite Ptolemy being his enemy. That drowning ended the Alexandrian War and made Cleopatra sole ruler of Egypt. She would reign for another 17 years until her own famous death. But if a teenage pharaoh drowning in the exact river seems accurate, wait until you see the soldier who was actually executed on the exact date for the exact conspiracy the game depicts. Thomas Hickey. Thomas Hickey was hanged on June 28, 1776 in New York City for conspiring to assassinate George Washington. And AC3 puts Connor at that execution on that exact date, stopping that exact plot. Sequence 8 of Assassin's Creed 3 focuses entirely on this conspiracy. Connor discovers that Hickey, a Templar operative who's infiltrated Washington's lifeguard, plans to poison the general during a military ceremony. Connor tries to stop him and gets framed for the assassination attempt instead. He's arrested, tried, and sentenced to hang. On the day of execution, June 28, 1776, Connor stood on the gallows with a noose around his neck. His assassin recruits cut the rope at the last second. Connor fights through the massive crowd of spectators. He catches Hickey just before the Templar can shoot Washington and kills him with his hidden blade. But here's what makes this wild. And Thomas Hickey was actually executed on June 28, 1776 for this conspiracy. The historical record documents it completely. Hickey was a soldier in Washington's lifeguard, a unit of hand-picked men assigned to protect the commander-in-chief. In June 1776, authorities uncovered a loyalist plot that potentially involved assassinating or kidnapping Washington. Hickey was implicated. He'd been jailed earlier for passing counterfeit money and bragged about the conspiracy to a fellow prisoner who informed authorities. He was arrested, court-martialed for mutiny and sedition, and sentenced to death. On June 28, 1776, approximately 20,000 spectators gathered to watch his execution. He was hanged in a public ceremony designed to demonstrate military justice and discipline. The game changes one critical detail. Historically, Hickey was hanged, and on the execution happened. In AC3, Connor intervenes and kills Hickey himself before the hanging can proceed. But the date, the location, the crowd size, the conspiracy against Washington, even the counterfeit money charge that led to his exposure, all of it matches historical documentation. Washington issued general orders after the execution warning soldiers against the corrupting influence of lewd women who Hickey blamed in his confession for leading him astray. That detail appears in primary source military documents. Royal Governor William Tryon, who coordinated the Loyalist conspiracy from a ship in New York Harbor, appears as a Templar antagonist in the game. The connections between game fiction and historical fact run incredibly deep. Robespierre, Maximilien de Robespierre, was shot in the jaw on July 27, 1794 at the Hôtel de Ville in Paris, and Unity depicts that wound with such precision that historians debated whether the game accidentally chose the correct shooter. Sequence 12 of Assassin's Creed Unity takes place during the fall of Robespierre, the Thermidorian reaction that ended the Reign of Terror. Arnaud and Elise storm the Hôtel de Ville, searching for the Templar Grandmaster Germain. They find Robespierre instead, surrounded by his loyalists as the National Convention turns against him. Elise interrogates him about Germain's location. Robespierre refuses to cooperate. Elise shoots him in the jaw. He survives long enough to write down information before being dragged to the guillotine the next day. The game shows the bloody jaw wound, the inability to speak, and his eventual execution in graphic detail. But this is exactly what happened to the historical Robespierre. On the night of July 27, 1794, the National Convention declared Robespierre an outlaw. He fled to the Hôtel de Ville with his allies. Around 2 a.m. on July 28th, soldiers stormed the building to arrest him. Someone shot Robespierre in the jaw. The bullet shattered his lower mandible. Surgeons documented placing wads of linen in his mouth and passing probes through the wound. He couldn't speak. He sat bleeding for hours while soldiers rounded up his supporters. On July 28th, he was guillotined along with 21 followers. Executioners reportedly removed the bandage from his jaw just before the blade fell, causing him to scream in agony. Here's what historians still debate. Who shot him? 3 theories exist. Theory 1, Robespierre attempted suicide but botched it. Theory 2, a gendarme named Charles-André Merda shot him during the arrest. Theory 3, the pistol accidentally discharged during a struggle. Primary sources contradict each other. No definitive answer exists after 230 years of historical analysis. Unity's version, where Elise shoots him, is literally as historically plausible as any other theory. The game picks one of the debated scenarios and runs with it. The jaw wound, the location, the date, the timing during the Thermidorian reaction, the subsequent execution, every documented detail matches perfectly. The French Left Party actually complained about Unity's portrayal, calling Robespierre's depiction as a bloodthirsty monster historically unfair. That's how accurate the game got. It sparked political controversy, but if a revolutionary shot in the jaw at the right building seems impressive, then wait until you see the Renaissance warlord who died at the exact city documented in 16th century chronicles, Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia died at Vienna, Spain in March 1507 during a siege, and Brotherhood does something almost unheard of in the franchise. It kills him at the exact city where he historically died. The final mission of AC Brotherhood takes place at the siege of Vienna in northern Spain. Cesare has escaped from prison and joined the forces of his brother-in-law, the King of Navarre. Ezio tracks him there for a final confrontation. The siege is in full chaos when you arrive. You fight through soldiers and scale the castle walls. At the top, Cesare waits in full armor for a boss fight. After defeating him, Ezio delivers his famous line about how Cesare cannot be killed by the hands of man, so he leaves him in the hands of fate. And Ezio throws Cesare off the castle walls to his death, but Cesare actually died at Vienna during this siege. Historical records document it precisely. After escaping from Spanish imprisonment, Cesare joined King John III of Navarre's forces in 1507. He fought at the siege of Vienna in March of that year. On the night of March 11, Cesare led a small force chasing fleeing enemy troops. They ambushed him in a ravine called Barranca Salada. 3 soldiers, Garcés de Agreda, Pedro de Allo, and Jimeno Garcés, surrounded and killed him with spears. They stripped his body of armor, clothing, and a distinctive leather mask he wore to hide facial disfigurement from syphilis. His corpse was left in the mud. The location accuracy is remarkable. Most AC games nail the date and change the location. Brotherhood gets both the year and the city correct. Viana, Spain, March 1507. During an active siege, the game even captures Cesare's imprisonment and escape that immediately preceded his death. The method changes from spear ambush to being thrown from walls, but the historical context, his service to Navarre, the siege setting, even details like the leather mask for his syphilis scars appear in the game's cutscenes and database entries. His epitaph originally read, "Here lies in Little Earth one who was feared by all, who held peace and war in his hand." That's the man whose personal motto was "Out Caesar, out nihil," either Caesar or nothing. The soldiers who killed him didn't even know who he was until afterward. They just killed the most infamous Borgia. But if one assassination happening at the exact historical city seems impressive, shouldn't wait until you see the dictator who received the exact number of stab wounds documented in Roman sources, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was stabbed 23 times on March 15th, 44 BCE in the theater of Pompey, and Origins counts every single wound. The final sequence of AC Origins sends Aya to Rome to eliminate the last members of the Order of the Ancients. She infiltrates the Senate meeting at the theater of Pompey on the Ides of March. Bayek's friend Septimius, now revealed as Caesar's Praetorian protector, stands guard. Aya defeats him in combat, then confronts Caesar directly. She delivers the first strike to his back with her hidden blade. Then Brutus emerges from the shadows. Then Cassius, then approximately 60 senators surround Caesar with daggers drawn. They stab him repeatedly while he staggers and falls. Caesar looks at Brutus and says in Greek, "You too, my child?" He collapses at the base of Pompey's statue. The game explicitly shows 23 wounds, but this is exactly how Caesar died. Roman historians Suetonius and Plutarch documented the assassination in detail. On March 15, 44 BCE, a group of approximately 60 senators, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, ambushed Caesar at a Senate meeting in the theater of Pompey. The regular Senate house was under restoration, so they met in Pompey's theater complex temporarily. Servilius Casca struck first. Caesar tried to block the blow and grabbed Casca's arm, asking, "Why are you doing this?" in Latin. Then the other conspirators closed in. They stabbed him 23 times. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey Magnus, his former rival and son-in-law. Most wounds were superficial because the senators were packed so tightly they kept hitting each other. Only 1 or 2 strikes were actually fatal. The game changes one detail. Aya strikes first instead of Casca. Everything else, the date, the location, the number of conspirators, the number of wounds, even Caesar's final words, matches Roman historical accounts written within decades of the event. Brutus's dagger appears as a collectible weapon in AC Brotherhood, connecting the two games across centuries. That single hidden blade became one of the most famous murder weapons in history. But if 23 documented stab wounds seems historically precise, wait until you see the British officer who was actually shot dead during the exact battle the game depicts, Major John Pitcairn. Major John Pitcairn was shot and killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, and AC3 changes literally nothing except who pulled the trigger. Sequence 7 of Assassin's Creed 3 drops Connor into one of the American Revolution's bloodiest battles. The British are launching their third assault on the American redoubt at Breed's Hill. Smoke fills the battlefield. Soldiers die by the hundreds. Connor infiltrates through the chaos with one objective: kill Major Pitcairn before before he can rally the British forces to victory. You track him through the fighting. He's on horseback, leading his Marines forward in formation. Connor performs an air assassination, leaping from cover and driving his hidden blade into Pitcairn as he rides past. The Major falls. The game treats this as one mission among many in Connor's campaign, but this is the most historically accurate assassination in the entire franchise. Major John Pitcairn actually died at the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775 by being shot. He was leading British Marines in the assault on the American position when multiple bullets struck him. American tradition credits Peter Salem, an African-American soldier, with firing the fatal shot. British accounts mention 4 bullets hitting Pitcairn at different points during the assault. He was carried from the battlefield by his son Thomas, a lieutenant in his unit. He died hours later in Boston. They buried him at the Old North Church. Every detail matches. The date, June 17, 1775. The location, Battle of Bunker Hill. The method, shot during combat. The circumstances, leading troops in assault. The historical outcome, he died that day from battlefield wounds. The only element AC3 changes is replacing Peter Salem or unknown soldiers with Connor. This is what makes it number 1. Every other assassination in this video involves someone who died naturally, died in an accident, or died by a method. The game completely changes. Pitcairn actually died by assassination during this exact battle. Ubisoft found a historical figure who was genuinely shot and killed on a documented date during a documented battle, then simply swapped in their protagonist as the shooter. It's a perfect substitution. 20,000 spectators watched Thomas Hickey hang. 60 senators stabbed Caesar. But only Pitcairn died the way the game shows, shot in combat at Bunker Hill. His matched flintlock pistols were captured by American forces and carried by General Israel Putnam for the rest of the war. Those pistols are now displayed at the Lexington Historical Society. Physical evidence of the man Connor killed. That's historical accuracy you can hold in your hands. Assassin's Creed has spent 30 years sneaking through some of the most famous buildings in human history, and the wild thing is, the history is almost always stranger than the fiction. Almost. Today we're breaking down the best historical landmarks the series has ever touched, what they actually are, and what the games got gloriously wrong. Starting with a monument that nobody, including the people who built it, can fully explain. Stonehenge. Here's the thing about Stonehenge. That's not a dramatic oversimplification. Archaeologists have been digging around this thing for centuries, and the honest answer is still a shrug. Built in phases between 3000 and 2000 BC in Wiltshire, England, the largest sarsen stones weigh roughly 25 tons each, and someone hauled them from 15 to 20 miles away with zero machinery and zero written explanation. The monument aligns perfectly with the summer and winter solstices, which tells us it was intentional and precise. But whether it was a ceremonial site, an astronomical calendar, a burial ground, or something else entirely, is still genuinely unresolved, which makes it absolutely perfect for Assassin's Creed. Assi Valhalla folds Stonehenge into its Isu mythology, treating it as a sacred node tied to an ancient precursor civilization that existed long before humanity. And before you roll your eyes, Ubisoft's explanation is structurally about as provable as anyone else's. The game's speculative answer only works because the real history left the door wide open. The fan community is split, predictably. Half see it as inspired world building that honors the site's genuine ambiguity. The other half feel a place of real spiritual and archaeological weight got repurposed as sci-fi set dressing. Both sides have a point, which is itself pretty on brand for a monument that refuses to give anyone a clean answer. If Stonehenge feels mysterious, wait until we get to a landmark where we know exactly how it was built, and somehow that makes it even more unbelievable. Next up, the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid of Giza. Here's a number that should break your brain a little. By the time Bayek is sneaking around the base of the Great Pyramid in AC Origins, that structure is already over 2,500 years old. Let that sit for a second. The Roman Empire, which most of us treat as ancient history, is closer to us today than the pyramid was to Bayek. You are playing a historical character doing archaeology on something that was ancient by his own standards. That's a layer of temporal depth most games don't even attempt. The pyramid was built for Pharaoh Khufu somewhere between 2589 and 2566 BC. At its peak, it stood 481 feet tall, constructed from roughly 2.3 million limestone blocks, each one weighing anywhere between 2 and 80 tons. The whole project took approximately 20 years and an estimated 100,000 workers, making it one of the largest coordinated construction efforts in human history, and that's not a loose claim. The logistics alone, moving that volume of stone with zero mechanized equipment, still has engineers genuinely impressed today. Assi Origins is set in 49 BC Ptolemaic Egypt, which means the game doesn't pretend the pyramid is a fresh construction. It treats it as an ancient ruin. The interior is dark, worn, stripped of most of its original casing stones. The game understood something that a lot of historical titles miss, which is that history has layers, and sometimes the most interesting thing you can do is show a character who is himself looking backwards. And that reframing hits differently when you're the one holding the controller. You're not just a modern player exploring ancient Egypt. You're a modern player controlling an ancient Egyptian, exploring something that was already ancient to him. The scale alone earns this one a spot on the list. But if Egypt's most iconic landmark impressed you, Greece's answer to it is a different kind of extraordinary: the Parthenon. Most people know the Parthenon as either a pristine white marble temple from a history textbook or a crumbling ruin sitting on a hilltop in Athens. What most people have never seen is the version A Sea Odyssey gives you: scaffolding everywhere, stone dust on the ground, workers hauling marble slabs up the Acropolis while you run past them on your way to stab someone. Here's the thing, that's not a creative liberty, that's just accurate. The Parthenon was built between 447 and 432 BC. A Sea Odyssey is set during the Peloponnesian War, which kicked off in 431 BC. So when you're exploring Athens in that game, the Parthenon is still under active construction. The building that would go on to define Western architecture and get copied by basically every government building in Washington, D.C. was, at that exact moment, a work in progress. Approximately 20,000 tons of Pentelic marble still being assembled. The finished monument you recognize from every ancient Greece documentary. Nobody alive in 431 BC had ever seen it either, and the timing gets more interesting. The Parthenon's completion in 432 BC coincides almost exactly with the outbreak of the war the entire game is built around. Pericles commissioned the thing as a symbol of Athenian power and ambition at the height of the Delian League, and it's that exact ambition, the overreach, the dominance, that turns the other Greek city-states against Athens and starts the conflict. The building isn't just set dressing, it's practically a monument to the reason the war begins. That's a genuinely smart historical choice by the developers. They could have just placed a completed, polished Parthenon in the game, and nobody would have complained. Instead, they looked at the dates, noticed the overlap, and built a construction site. A Sea Odyssey is one of the only games in the franchise where a landmark shows up mid-build, and it earns the detail. If you want a landmark with zero construction uncertainty, though, Solomon's Temple has a different kind of problem entirely. Solomon's Temple. Here's the thing about Solomon's Temple. It is the only landmark in this entire video that nobody has ever actually seen. Not in centuries, not in any form. The original temple, built around 957 BC in Jerusalem by King Solomon, was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar II and the Babylonian army in 586 BC. Then, after the second temple was built on the same site, Rome came along in 70 AD and destroyed that one too. Zero physical remains of either structure survive today. Every architectural detail we have, the dimensions, the layout, the 45-foot ceilings, the inner sanctum housing the Ark of the Covenant, all of it comes from biblical texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and centuries of rabbinical writing. A C1 built an entire landmark from ancient literature and religious tradition. That is genuinely fascinating, and nobody talks about it. The game places it at the center of its Third Crusade setting, 1191 AD, roughly 1,700 years after the original temple's destruction. By that point, the site in Jerusalem had already been a mosque for 5 centuries, but AC1 treats the temple as a vault, a hiding place for a piece of Eden, simultaneously contested by assassins, Templars, and Crusaders. A 3-way tug of war over the most religiously loaded ground on Earth. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. That framing, a single site pulling 3 major powers into violent conflict over irreconcilable claims to it, is not dramatic invention. That is just what Solomon's Temple has actually been throughout history. Jews, Christians, and Muslims have each assigned the site layers of sacred meaning that cannot be reconciled without someone losing something they consider fundamental. The game didn't manufacture that tension for narrative convenience. It inherited it from 3,000 years of actual human conflict. Whether that was intentional on Ubisoft's part is debatable, but the result is a landmark that functions as a MacGuffin in the exact same way the real site has always functioned in history. The fan debate around this one is worth taking seriously. Some argue AC1 treats the temple superficially, reducing profound spiritual significance to a treasure hunt objective. Others point out that a game set during the Crusades, depicting multi-faction violence over Jerusalem's holiest ground is, if anything, more historically grounded than most games bother to attempt. Both arguments have merit, which is, not ideal for people who wanted a clean answer. The Colosseum at least still exists, and it has a very different kind of history attached to it. The Colosseum. At peak capacity, the Colosseum held somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 people inside a single building. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the size of a modern NFL stadium, built in 80 AD by hand, without power tools or structural engineering software. Construction started under Emperor Vespasian in 72 AD and finished under Titus 8 years later. The finished structure ran 617 feet long, 510 feet wide, and 157 feet tall. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most absurdly ambitious things a civilization has ever decided to do with its Tuesday afternoons. But here's where it gets interesting, because the Colosseum that shows up in Assassin's Creed isn't the Colosseum. Not really. A C2 visits Rome in 1476. Brotherhood returns to the same city in 1500. Both games include the Colosseum, which means the franchise gives you two separate looks at the same building across a 24-year gap, and what you're looking at in both cases isn't a functioning arena. By the 15th century, the Colosseum had been partially stripped for building materials, colonized by vegetation, and repurposed by locals as a combination of housing and fortress. The grandest entertainment venue in Roman history had become essentially a very large source of free stone and a convenient place to store people. The games depict this accurately. You're not walking into a working stadium. You're walking into a ruin that is already inside another ruin, which has a certain poetry to it if you're in the right mood. Here's the thing nobody really talks about though. The fact that AC2 and Brotherhood both include the Colosseum at different points in time means the franchise accidentally created a 2-point archaeological dataset. Players who move from one game to the other are doing, roughly speaking, what archaeologists do when they track structural degradation across historical records. The building looks different, the decay has progressed, the surrounding context has shifted. That's not something the developers set out to document, but the result is a genuinely useful comparison that mirrors how historians actually study architectural decline. The game stumbled into being an unintentional history lesson, which is a sentence I did not expect to write today. If you think that's an impressive piece of accidental preservation, wait until we get to a building that wasn't just preserved in a game, but actively helped restore a real one. Next up, the Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia. There is a dome in Istanbul that should not exist. Not metaphorically. Literally, the people who designed it could not fully explain why it stayed up. Built between 532 and 537 AD under Emperor Justinian I, the central dome spans roughly 102 feet in diameter and sits 184 feet above the floor with 0 supporting columns underneath it. Byzantine mathematician Isidorus, one of the two minds behind the project, later described the dome as appearing suspended from heaven by a golden chain, and that was not poetry. That was a genuine attempt by one of the architects to explain something he cannot account for on paper. It has stood for nearly 1,500 years. The dome sits on a ring of 40 windows that flood the interior with light, creating the visual illusion that it is floating above the rest of the building. So the effect Isidorus was reaching for words to describe is also something every person who walks inside immediately notices. It genuinely looks detached. That is not the light playing tricks on you. That is the light doing exactly what two 6th century mathematicians calculated it would do. But the dome is only part of what makes this building strange. By the time Ezio walks through it in AC Revelations set in 1511 Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia has already been an Eastern Orthodox cathedral, a Roman Catholic church following the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and an Ottoman mosque after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. 3 completely distinct religious identities inside the same walls. No other landmark in this video has pulled that off. Most buildings get one identity and keep it. The Hagia Sophia got 3, each one replacing the last without anyone destroying the structure because nobody who ever controlled it could bring themselves to. AC Revelations uses it largely as parkour terrain and backdrop, which fair enough, it looks incredible. But the game sidesteps almost entirely the fact that Ezio is moving through a building whose identity is still being contested in 1511, a space where the political and religious history of an entire empire is written into the architecture around him. That context would have made every scene inside it hit harder. Fans have been pointing that out since launch. Still, even as scenery, it is hard to look at and feel nothing. If the Hagia Sophia represents what human ambition produces when it refuses to accept structural limitations, then what comes next is what happens when one man decides to solve an engineering problem everyone else gave up on. Santa Maria del Fiore. Brunelleschi built the largest brick dome in human history, and then refused to tell anyone how he did it. That's not mythology, that's documented. When city officials asked him to explain his method to competitors, he declined. He kept the technique largely secret throughout construction, and when rivals tried to replicate his approach, they couldn't. The dome he finished in 1436 sat atop a cathedral that had been under construction since 1296, meaning Florence spent 140 years building a church and then ran out of ideas for the ceiling. Brunelleschi solved a problem that had stumped every engineer on the continent, built a dome 154 feet in diameter without internal wooden scaffolding, covered it in 3.6 million tiles in geometric patterns, pushed the total structure to 367 feet tall, and then essentially said, "You're welcome," and kept his mouth shut. Nobody matched it for over 500 years. Here's the thing, that's already a genuinely extraordinary story, and AC2 hasn't even shown up yet. When the game uses Santa Maria del Fiore as the setting for the Pazzi conspiracy sequence, it's staging drama inside a building that was the actual site of the real Pazzi conspiracy. And the real event barely needs a game to make it more cinematic because it was already unhinged. On April 26, 1478, members of the Pazzi family and their allies assassinated Giuliano de' Medici and attempted to kill his brother Lorenzo during High Mass inside the cathedral, in front of the congregation, during church. Giuliano was stabbed 19 times, which, suggests a level of commitment that goes slightly beyond a political disagreement. Lorenzo survived, escaped into the sacristy, and within weeks had executed or exiled nearly everyone involved. The game's version maps onto this so cleanly, it's almost suspicious. A C2 doesn't need to invent intrigue or inflate the stakes because the real event was already a politically motivated double murder inside one of the most famous buildings in Europe, executed by a banking family with papal backing. This is one of those rare cases where the franchise's dramatic instincts and documented history land in exactly the same place at the same time. Most historical landmarks in AC are impressive backgrounds. Santa Maria del Fiore is the one where reality already wrote the script. If you thought that building had stories, wait until you hear about Castel Sant'Angelo, which started as a Roman emperor's tomb and somehow ended up as the Borgia family's private fortress, Castel Sant'Angelo. Here's a building that has had, genuinely, one of the more eventful existences of any structure on the planet. Tomb, fortress, papal panic room, villain's lair, not metaphorically, all four, in sequence. Hadrian built it in 139 AD as his own mausoleum, because when you're emperor of apparently you get to commission a 210-foot tall cylindrical monument to yourself as a retirement plan. It stored his remains, his family's remains, and later the remains of several other emperors who presumably had no say in the matter. Then, over the next 12 centuries, it slowly became something else entirely. By 1379, it had been fully converted into a defensive castle, incorporated into the city's defensive walls. Popes started using it as an emergency refuge whenever things got violent, which in medieval Rome was basically every other Tuesday. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting. The castle held the papal treasury, sacred relics, and at various points the Holy Lance, the spear historically claimed to have pierced Christ at the crucifixion. So this building was simultaneously a military fortress and a storage unit for some of the most spiritually significant objects in Christian history. But the real detail, the one that sounds like something a game developer invented and absolutely did not, is the Pozzetto di Borgo. It's a fortified, elevated corridor running about 2,600 feet directly from Castel Sant'Angelo to the Vatican, a secret escape tunnel connecting the Pope's home to a castle. Two separate popes used it to flee actual military attacks. Pope Clement VII sprinted down it in 1527, while Spanish and German forces were literally sacking Rome outside. The corridor exists, you can visit it. It is a real thing that real people used to run for their lives. AC Brotherhood includes the Pozzetto as a playable section, which is one of those moments where you think, okay, obviously they made that up, and then you look it up, and no, they didn't. The other thing Brotherhood does is flip the castle's entire historical function by making it Borgia headquarters. The building that real popes used as a sanctuary becomes the villain's base of operations. The irony is rich, though probably not as intentional as it sounds, given the papacy's own documented history of using the castle for deeply non-spiritual political maneuvers. The Borgias fit right in. If a building that served as a tomb, fortress, and papal treasury can hold its own, wait until you hear about a cathedral that survived an entire revolution and still needed a video game to save it. Notre Dame de Paris. AC Unity had a rough launch. Technically broken, widely mocked, review bombed into the ground. And for a few years that was the story. A troubled open-world game that Ubisoft released too early and the internet never let them forget. Then, in April 2019, Notre Dame caught fire. The spire collapsed, the roof burned. 750 years of architectural history came within a few hours of being gone completely. Restoration teams moved in almost immediately, and here's where it gets weird. One of the documented visual resources they referenced was AEC Unity, not as a replacement for professional surveys, but as a legitimate supplemental archive. The game had rendered Notre Dame in such precise detail, down to stone carvings and interior geometry, that it became genuinely useful. A video game, one that people were mocking 5 years earlier. That's not a small thing. That's one of the only times in history a piece of entertainment software provided real architectural utility following an actual disaster. Here's the context that makes it land even harder. Construction on Notre Dame began in 1163. It took nearly 2 centuries to reach completion, sits at 406 feet tall, contains 7,800 tons of stone, and has 280 stained glass windows. It survived the French Revolution of 1789, which is exactly the historical moment AEC Unity depicts. Crowds tore through Paris, the monarchy collapsed, and Notre Dame stood through all of it. The game was built around that specific period. Ubisoft spent years recreating every facade, every buttress, every interior arch at a level of fidelity that went well beyond what you needed for a chase sequence across the rooftops. Nobody planned for the 2019 fire. That's the part that sits with you. Unity was released 5 years before any of that happened. The developers were trying to make a good game, not a time capsule, but that's exactly what it became. By accident, a detailed snapshot of Notre Dame at its most complete, preserved in a medium that can be copied, distributed, and explored by anyone with a computer. Ubisoft eventually released a version of Unity for free, specifically so people could walk through the pre-fire cathedral. Not as marketing, just so it existed somewhere accessible. A critically panned game handed an unexpected legacy by one of the worst architectural disasters of the modern era. There's no neat moral there. It just happened that way. Westminster Abbey has its own complicated history, and if you think Notre Dame's story is a lot, wait until you hear what the English managed to do with theirs. Westminster Abbey. Here's the thing about Westminster Abbey. It doesn't just contain history, it is history. Stacked 17 layers deep and compressed into 511 feet of Gothic stone sitting in the middle of London. Construction started in 1245 under Henry III and was largely done by 1517. The building measures 511 feet long and 210 feet wide at the transepts, which are genuinely enormous numbers, but the dimensions aren't even the interesting part. What makes Westminster Abbey unlike almost any other structure on Earth is what's inside it. 17 royal tombs, over 3,300 individual burials. More historically significant people are buried within these walls than in any other single building in the entire English-speaking world. Poets, scientists, monarchs, military commanders, all stacked in there together like the world's most prestigious filing cabinet. But the coronations are what cement its place in history. Westminster Abbey has been the site of every English coronation since 1066. William the Conqueror was crowned there, so was every single English and later British monarch for nearly 1,000 years after him. The current Gothic structure wasn't even built yet when that tradition started, which means the coronation predates the building. The legitimacy of the British monarchy runs through this specific piece of ground, not just the building on top of it. That's not symbolic. That's the actual political mechanics of how the monarchy functioned for a millennium. So naturally, AEC 3 kind of fumbles it. And look, the game has an obvious problem here. It's primarily set in colonial America. Westminster Abbey is in London. The creative gymnastics required to get an American Revolutionary War narrative anywhere near that building are significant, and the game doesn't quite stick the landing. British players especially have noted that the Abbey's inclusion feels compressed and oddly casual, with security that would make any actual palace guard resign in embarrassment. The geography is porous in a way that even generous AC standards can't fully absorb. But the deeper issue is a narrative one. Westminster Abbey is the burial site of real historical figures, people the game's conspiracy-driven framing of the revolution has complicated opinions about at best. There's an awkward tension between a landmark defined by the weight of genuine history and a storyline that treats historical figures as chess pieces in a Templar versus Assassin grudge match. The Abbey doesn't bend easily to that kind of retrofitting. The history is too dense, too specific, too real. It ends up being a case where the landmark wins. The Abbey is so historically overpowering that the game almost disappears next to it. If you want a landmark that actually works in harmony with AC3's Revolutionary War setting, though you don't need to cross the Atlantic, you just need to walk into Independence Hall. Independence Hall. There is no building in American history that carries more weight per square foot than Independence Hall. The Declaration of Independence, signed in 1776, the Constitutional Convention wrapped up in 1787, the entire philosophical foundation of the United States hammered out across two separate world-changing events in the same room. More foundational American political decisions were made inside this single building than anywhere else in the country's history. That is not an exaggeration. That is just the ledger. Edmund Woolley and Andrew Hamilton designed the original Pennsylvania State House starting in 1732, finished in 1756, and the clock tower reaches 110 feet, which feels about right for a building that has been looming over American identity ever since. The physical structure is modest by European standards. What happened inside it is not. AC3 uses Independence Hall as a thematically central location, a nexus point for animus sequences, the physical embodiment of everything the game's American Revolution narrative is building toward. The game treats the building with genuine reverence. Liberty, freedom, the birth of a nation, all of that. And then there's Connor. Here's the thing, Connor Kenway is Mohawk. Half English, half Radonake-Ton, fighting across the entire Revolutionary War to protect ideals that are, at the exact moment he's protecting them, being built on land taken from his people. He is defending a building where men are constructing a government that has zero intention of including him or anyone he loves. The irony is not subtle. The game puts it right in front of you and then does not fully commit to what it means. That is the most sophisticated piece of character meets landmark storytelling in the franchise, and also the most frustrating, because AC3 gets right up to the edge of saying something genuinely difficult and then pulls back. Connor's relationship with Independence Hall is complicated in ways that most games would never attempt, and in ways that this game never fully resolves. He fights for it, he believes in the idea of it, and the idea of it does not return the favor. The tension sits there, beneath every scene set in that building, unaddressed, which is honestly historically accurate in its own way. The men inside Independence Hall in 1776 and 1787 also did not fully resolve it. They put it in a drawer and handed the drawer to future generations. AC3 does the same thing. You can read that as a failure of nerve or as an unusually honest reflection of real history. Neither answer is comfortable, and the game deserves credit for manufacturing the discomfort even if it flinches before going all the way. Independence Hall is the only landmark on this list where the building and the protagonist are in direct philosophical conflict, and the game just lets that contradiction breathe. That is worth something. Not everything with a similar layered quality shows up in the same era, though. Black Flag takes a completely different approach, dropping you into colonial Cuba and a building that, technically speaking, should not even exist yet. That's where we're headed next, Havana Cathedral. Walk into the Plaza de la Catedral in Havana, Cuba, and you are standing in front of one of the most architecturally distinctive buildings in the entire Western Hemisphere. The Catedral de la Virgen María de la Concepción Inmaculada de la Habana, which is a name that takes roughly as long to say as it took to build, is a Baroque limestone structure with twin asymmetrical bell towers rising 120 feet into the Caribbean sky. The overall footprint runs about 180 feet by 92 feet. Every block was cut from local quarry stone, which gives the whole facade this warm, honeyed texture that no European cathedral in the franchise can match. In AC Black Flag, it anchors colonial Havana beautifully. The asymmetrical towers, the plaza, the salt-bleached stone, the sense that this city exists somewhere between the old world and the new, it feels exactly right. It feels like Havana. Here's the thing though, Edward Kenway's story is set between 1715 and 1722. Construction on the Havana Cathedral did not begin until 1748. It was not completed until 1777. The building Edward explores, the landmark you climb and use for navigation and absorb as part of this world, was not built yet. It would not exist for another 26 years after the game ends. That is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most straightforward anachronisms in the entire franchise, and it raises a question that AC has never really bothered to answer directly. When a game puts a building in the wrong century, does the landmark still do its job? Because here is what is interesting. Havana Cathedral absolutely does its job. It makes colonial Cuba feel specific and real and lived in. It gives the city an identity. It gives players a reference point. The warm limestone and the asymmetrical towers and the plaza setting create an atmosphere that you remember. It is one of the most genuinely striking set pieces in the whole Black Flag experience, and it earns that entirely on its own terms. The historical placement just does not hold up if you check the dates, which most players never do, because why would you? You are a pirate. But that tension, the gap between what is cinematically true and what is historically accurate, is not really a Black Flag problem. It is the franchise's founding tension. A C has always been in the business of making history feel real more than making it feel accurate. The Parthenon still under construction in Odyssey. Notre Dame's interior and unity rendered in detail no medieval peasant could have accessed. The Hagia Sophia's transformation across centuries compressed into a single explorable space. These games have always negotiated between the world as it was and the world as it needs to feel. Havana Cathedral is just an unusually clean, almost self-contained example of that negotiation, because the math is so simple. Wrong century, great cathedral. Pick one. What is interesting is that most players pick the cathedral, not consciously but experientially. You move through that plaza, you look up at those towers, and you feel something accurate about colonial Havana even if nothing about the chronology is. That is not a failure of design. That might actually be the point. The entire franchise runs on a version of that logic. The Animus has always been the excuse, and the excuse has always been thin, and nobody has ever really cared because the landmarks deliver something that a strict historical simulation probably could not. They deliver the feeling of a place that is harder to achieve than accuracy and honestly more valuable to the experience. So maybe the question is not whether Havana Cathedral belongs in 1715. Maybe the question is whether a game about pirates and assassins and ancient conspiracies ever owed you strict accuracy in the first place. Turns out, no. The Assassin's Creed franchise has quietly built some of the most stunning historical worlds in all of gaming. From ancient temples to industrial skylines, these places weren't just backdrops. They were painstakingly researched recreations of civilizations at their peak. So today, I'm breaking down the most beautiful locations across the entire series and exactly what makes them so impressive, starting with a world that completely lied to you about what ancient history looked like. Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Here's something that will genuinely change how you think about the ancient world. When you picture ancient Greece, you picture white marble columns, dusty beige ruins, and a whole lot of gray stone. Everybody does, and everybody is wrong. The development team behind Odyssey didn't just Google some reference photos and call it a day. World director Ben Hall and art director Thierry Dansereau led actual scouting expeditions to Greece. Not to look at it, to feel it. To stand in the spaces where these civilizations lived and understand the landscape on a physical level. And the single most important thing they discovered completely changed the game's entire visual direction. Ancient Greece was colorful. Extremely colorful. The Greeks painted everything. Their buildings, their statues, their sculptures, all of it covered in vibrant pigments. They used color to make structures visually legible and distinct from one another. The bleached white ruins we associate with ancient Greece, that's just what happens after 2,000 years of sun and rain strip the paint away. The real ancient Greece looked like a Mediterranean fever dream of rich blues, warm yellows, and deep greens. This discovery overhauled Odyssey's entire palette. The game practically glows, and nowhere is this more obvious than Athens. The Acropolis is restored to peak condition, with the Parthenon's columns painted in colors matched to actual historical evidence. The pediments are populated with sculptures referencing real classical art. It's not a ruin. It's a living, breathing city at the height of its power. But the ambition goes way beyond one city. Odyssey spans over 70 distinct cities and regions, making it the most massive historical canvas the franchise had attempted at the time. And here's the thing, Greece only has about 7 natural geographic biomes. That's not enough visual variety to fill a world this big. So the developers layered historical economic research on top of the geography. Arcadia looks like the wheat-growing breadbasket it historically was, complete with appropriate vegetation and agricultural workers populating the fields. Every region doesn't just look different. It looks different for a historically accurate reason, but if Odyssey rewrote what you thought ancient Greece looked like, the next entry rewrote what you thought ancient Egypt looked like, and it might be even more impressive. Assassin's Creed 2. This is the game that taught the entire franchise how to build a city, and nearly 2 decades later, nothing Ubisoft has made has fully topped what they pulled off here. Florence in the late 15th century is gorgeous in the most understated way possible. Red-tiled roofs stretching in every direction, narrow winding streets that feel like they were designed by someone who'd actually walked through them, and architectural anchors like the Santa Maria Novella Church and the Palazzo Medici grounding the whole thing in real history. But here's what makes Florence special. It's small. Compared to the massive open worlds that came after it, Florence is almost claustrophobically compact, and that constraint is exactly why it works. Every single street has a reason to exist. Every alley leads somewhere. Every rooftop connects to another rooftop in a way that feels intentional rather than procedurally generated. The city doesn't feel like a map. It feels like a neighborhood. And that intimacy is something the franchise has been chasing ever since. But then there's Venice. And Venice is where the developers decided to show off. Here's the thing about the real Venice. It's an archipelago of 124 islands formed by 183 canals and connected by 438 bridges. It's not a normal city. It's an aquatic maze. And the team had to rebuild that maze as a fully functional navigation system from scratch. For the first time in the franchise, players had 2 entirely separate movement networks, water and foot, because the city's geography literally demanded it. The Grand Canal, the Dorsoduro waterfront, the Rialto Bridge, these aren't just pretty backdrops. They determine how you can actually move through the world. You can't just run in a straight line from point A to point B. The water forces you to think differently about traversal, and that's a design achievement that doesn't get enough credit. The architecture sells it even further. Venetian Gothic is a hybrid style, Gothic lancet arches blended with Byzantine and Ottoman influences, and it gives Venice a visual identity that's completely distinct from mainland Italian cities. But it's not just eye candy. That architectural language serves a functional design purpose. Players can intuitively read faction control and power structures from what the buildings look like. The architecture tells you where you are and who controls it without a single line of dialogue. The community debate over which city is the better achievement is genuinely interesting because both sides have a point. Florence wins on intimacy and authenticity. It feels real in a way that larger maps struggle to replicate. Venice wins on environmental distinctiveness and sheer visual ambition. It's a city that forced the developers to rethink how players move through space entirely. 2 cities, 2 philosophies of historical recreation, and both of them still hold up. But if you think Renaissance Italy set a high bar, wait until you see what happens when the franchise goes back thousands of years further. Assassin's Creed Origins. Ptolemaic Egypt in Origins is widely considered the single most visually impressive rendering of an ancient civilization in the entire franchise, and honestly, it's hard to argue. The pyramids of Giza alone are worth the price of admission. Here's the thing most people don't realize: the in-game pyramids still have their original limestone casing and golden tips intact. That's something modern tourists will never see. The real pyramids have been stripped down to their rough inner blocks for centuries, but in Origins, they shimmer in the Egyptian sun exactly the way they would have thousands of years ago, surrounded by palm trees, oases, and Nile Valley vegetation that communicates the razor-sharp border between fertile land and endless desert. It's genuinely breathtaking, but here's where it gets complicated. One of the game's most stunning locations, the Library of Alexandria, is almost entirely made up. Not in a lazy way, in a nobody on Earth actually knows what this building looked like way. The library's physical form is based on fragmentary written accounts from ancient historians like Strabo, who described what the library did, not what it looked like. And whatever physical remains might still exist are likely underwater, buried beneath the Mediterranean due to dramatic shoreline recession since antiquity. A PhD student in Egyptian archaeology who consulted on the game put it perfectly. The Library of Alexandria in Origins has an air of authenticity, but is nothing more than mere guesswork. Let that sink in. One of the most authoritative-looking historical recreations in gaming history is educated fiction, and that creates a genuine philosophical problem. In traditional archaeology, when you reconstruct a building, you use different colors or materials to signal which parts are based on evidence and which parts are speculation. A video game can't do that without completely shattering immersion. You can't have half the Library of Alexandria rendered in gray placeholder textures just because nobody knows what the columns looked like. So the developers did something clever instead. They built Discovery Tour Mode, a separate experience that lets players access behind-the-scenes context about what evidence or lack of it informed each design decision. It's basically a built-in honesty system for a world that has to look confident even when the history isn't. Even the pyramids, whose external form is well documented, required interpretive choices about color and surface treatment that aren't historically settled. The developers had to pick a version of history and commit to it. And that tension between visual confidence and historical uncertainty is what makes Origins so fascinating. It's not just beautiful. It's beautiful in a way that forces you to ask how much of what you're seeing is real. But if Origins made you question what ancient Egypt actually looked like, wait until you see what Ubisoft did with a city that was still very much alive when they recreated it. Assassin's Creed Revelations. Constantinople is a city built on top of itself, and Revelations is one of the only games in the entire franchise that actually grapples with that idea instead of pretending it doesn't exist. This is Ezio Auditore's final destination, the end of the road for the most iconic assassin in the series, and the developers didn't send him to some generic historical backdrop. They sent him to arguably the most architecturally layered city the franchise has ever attempted, because Constantinople isn't just one civilization's achievement. It's the product of multiple civilizations stacking their legacies on top of each other, literally for centuries. Byzantine foundations holding up Ottoman superstructures, Christian churches converted into mosques, ancient Roman infrastructure repurposed for a new empire's ambitions. The game is set after the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, and here's where the narrative gets interesting. Revelations doesn't frame Ottoman rule as a tragedy, it frames it as an opportunity. The Assassin Brotherhood, which had been struggling under Byzantine control, could once again flourish in the city under the protection of Grand Vizier Ishak Pasha. That's a deliberate editorial choice by the developers, and it's a surprisingly nuanced one. Instead of defaulting to Empire falls, everything is sad. The game says Empire falls, new power rises, and the Brotherhood adapts. The Assassins established 7 operational dens across Constantinople, and those dens aren't randomly placed. They're distributed through the game world in ways that reflect how the Brotherhood actually integrated into Ottoman society, both geographically and politically. Now, the architecture. Constantinople occupies a unique position in the franchise because it doesn't play by the same rules as earlier Ezio cities. Florence emphasizes horizontal spread. Venice exploits vertical variation with its canals and bridges. Constantinople does neither. It emphasizes monumentality and geometric precision. The Ottoman aesthetic is about scale and pattern, and the game commits to that fully. The Topkapi Palace, commissioned by Sultan Mehmet II, with construction beginning around 1459 and spanning nearly 2 decades, serves as the visual centerpiece of the Ottoman quarter. And then there's the Hagia Sophia, that massive Byzantine church converted to a mosque, its dome visible from almost anywhere in the game world. It functions as a constant visual anchor. No matter where you are in Constantinople, you can orient yourself by that dome. That's not just beautiful, that's smart environmental design. The Grand Bazaar buzzes with commercial life in a way that feels genuinely alive. Constantinople was historically the trade hub connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the game leans into that energy. Merchants, crowds, the density of human activity in those market corridors. It sells the idea that this city is the center of the world. But here's the one: honest criticism. Some districts use repetitive building assets. You'll notice certain residential structures copy-pasted across neighborhoods, and attentive players absolutely pick up on it. This was a compromise the developers made to handle the computational demands of rendering a city this massive. It doesn't ruin the setting. Constantinople still feels distinct and historically rich, but it does occasionally remind you that you're playing a game from 2011 rather than experiencing a flawless recreation. Even with that limitation, Constantinople stands as one of the franchise's most thoughtful settings. It's not just pretty, it's historically layered in a way that most games wouldn't even attempt. But if you think Ottoman Constantinople pushed the boundaries of what the franchise could build, wait until you see what they did with an entire revolution. Assassin's Creed Unity. Most Assassin's Creed games build beautiful cities the same way. Famous landmarks connected by generic filler streets. Unity threw that entire philosophy out the window. Here's the thing, Unity's Paris wasn't designed to be a monument tour. The developers made a deliberate choice to invest heavily in interiors. Not just palace interiors, hundreds of residential buildings, commercial shops, and multi-level structures that you could actually enter and explore. The narrow streets lead into hidden courtyards. Those courtyards connect to staircases that wind through apartments. Those apartments open onto rooftops that overlook entirely different neighborhoods. Paris in Unity feels like a city where people actually live, not a collection of famous buildings separated by empty space, and that philosophy is what makes it special. Because the real beauty of Unity's Paris isn't Notre Dame or the Bastille, it's the feeling of ducking through a back alley, climbing through someone's window, crossing their living room, and dropping out the other side into a courtyard you never knew existed. The city has a social interior life. You experience how ordinary Parisians moved through their daily routines, and that level of immersion was genuinely unprecedented for the franchise. But the landmarks that are here? They're remarkable for a very specific reason. The Palace of Versailles appears in its pre-19th century form, before later modifications changed it forever. The Louvre is rendered without the famous glass pyramid that wasn't added until the 1980s. You're literally walking through versions of these buildings that no longer exist in the physical world. Unity's Paris isn't just a recreation, it's a time capsule. Now here's where it gets complicated. Unity's Paris is not a pleasant place to be, and that's intentional. The visual palette is dense and grim. Haze and hearth smoke hang over crowded districts, communicating the reality of a late 18th century city choking on its own overpopulation and political chaos in a way that hits you the second you load in. Compare this to Odyssey's sunlit Mediterranean or Origin's golden desert, and the difference is almost shocking. Unity's Paris feels heavy, oppressive even, and this is a genuine point of debate in the community. Some players argue that the grimness makes Unity the most historically honest setting in the entire franchise. Revolutionary Paris was dirty, chaotic, and suffocating. The environment communicates that truth without saying a single word. Other players push back and say that historical accuracy shouldn't come at the cost of visual enjoyment. A beautiful game should be beautiful to look at, period. Both sides have a point. Unity is objectively one of the most technically impressive cities the franchise has ever built. The architectural ambition is staggering even by modern standards. But inhabiting it for dozens of hours? That's a different question. This is a city in crisis, and every smoke-hazed street and cramped alleyway reminds you of that fact. But if Unity's grimness feels heavy, the next entry on this list takes a completely different approach to atmosphere, and the result is one of the most unexpected settings in franchise history. Assassin's Creed Rogue. Every other entry in this video has one thing in common. They're all about what humans built. Temples, palaces, cathedrals, entire cities designed to impress you. Rogue throws all of that out the window. There are no ancient cities here, no famous landmarks, no Renaissance streets, just the North Atlantic, endless ice, and the constant feeling that you are completely, utterly alone. And that's exactly why it belongs on this list. Rogue's Arctic setting is the franchise's biggest departure from its own formula, and the visual appeal comes from something the series almost never relies on: raw environmental drama. We're talking frozen shipwrecks scattered through ice fields, their masts jutting out of the snow like grave markers, dynamic blizzards that slash visibility to near zero. And then, when you dock at certain locations, the northern lights appear overhead, painting the sky in greens and purples so vivid they feel like they belong in a completely different game. Here's the thing about those blizzards. They're not just pretty weather effects. The storm system in Rogue is technically significant because it fundamentally changes how you play. When a blizzard hits, visibility drops so severely that you can't rely on your minimap or line of sight anymore. You have to navigate by landmark recognition and spatial memory. That's a completely different cognitive demand than any other Assassin's Creed setting creates. You're not parkouring across rooftops, you're squinting through a wall of white, trying to remember where you saw that rock formation 10 minutes ago. The environment isn't just scenery here, it's a mechanic. Your ship, the Morrigan, requires an icebreaker ram to push through frozen waters. That's not a cosmetic upgrade. Without it, entire sections of the map are physically inaccessible. The Arctic doesn't care how good your weapons are, it will stop you with ice, and that creates something the franchise rarely delivers: genuine isolation. There are fewer settlement hubs in Rogue than almost any other AC game, more open water navigation, a constant pressing sense of distance from anything resembling civilization. You're not exploring a world full of people, you're surviving one that's actively hostile to your existence. That's what makes the Northern Lights hit so hard. They're spectacular precisely because they appear in a place that's trying to kill you. Beauty and danger aren't separated in the Arctic. They're the same thing. One moment you're fighting through a blizzard that could sink your ship, and the next you're staring at the sky in complete silence, watching light ripple across the atmosphere like something out of a nature documentary. Now, the honest criticism. Compared to Black Flag's Caribbean, the Arctic can feel visually repetitive. A lot of gray water, a lot of white ice. The color palette is narrow by design, and some players bounced off that hard. But fans of the setting will tell you that's the entire point. The desolation is what makes the rare moments of beauty hit harder. When everything is gray and hostile for an hour straight, and then the sky suddenly explodes with color, that contrast creates an emotional response that a constantly beautiful setting simply can't replicate. Rogue proves you don't need human architecture to create something breathtaking. Sometimes nature alone is enough, but if you want a setting that combines natural beauty with one of the most culturally rich civilizations in human history, the next entry delivers exactly that. Assassin's Creed Mirage. Here's the thing about Mirage. Every Assassin's Creed game looks beautiful. That's basically the franchise's whole deal at this point. But Mirage did something that none of the other games had ever fully committed to. It didn't just recreate a place, it recreated a culture. Mirage takes the series to 9th century Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age, a civilization at the absolute peak of its intellectual and cultural power. This is a setting that shaped mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy for the entire world, and somehow the franchise had never touched it. That alone makes it significant. But what Ubisoft actually did with it goes way deeper than just building pretty mosques and marketplaces. Let's start with the House of Wisdom, because most people get this wrong. It wasn't one building. It wasn't some ancient library with a single front door. The House of Wisdom was a complex of institutions spread across Baghdad, functioning more like a college town than a single campus. Scholars from completely different disciplines would meet, collaborate, and exchange ideas across the city. Mirage actually reflects this. The intellectual life of Baghdad isn't confined to one location you visit during a story mission. It's woven into the city itself. But here's where it gets really impressive. The cultural authenticity in this game goes layers deeper than architecture. The game features proper Arabic pronunciation and authentic Arabic language throughout. Not approximations, not sounds close enough. Actual Arabic. The Assassin's Crest itself was designed by calligraphist Haytham Arafa, who drew directly from Abbasid-era manuscripts and Islamic calligraphic traditions. The call to prayer was recorded by a professional muaddidin. The names within the Order of the Ancients pull from Arabic and Farsi legends and myths. Every single one of those details represents a deliberate choice to get it right, not just close enough. And that's not a checklist exercise. When you stack language, religious practice, visual art, and naming conventions together, what you're looking at is the franchise's most thorough commitment to cultural authenticity, period. It goes beyond surface-level aesthetics into something that actually respects the civilization it's portraying. The round city of Baghdad anchors the whole experience geographically. That distinctive circular layout gives the city a sense of intentional design that feels completely different from any other Assassin's Creed setting. The Grand Bazaar pulses with commercial energy. Residential quarters feel lived in. The whole city communicates a civilization that isn't just surviving, it's thriving. The response from Islamic scholars and cultural commentators has been overwhelmingly positive. Many praised how the game represents this civilization during its most intellectually productive period, something Western media has historically either ignored or reduced to stereotypes. Mirage doesn't do that. It celebrates. But here's the honest tension that nobody wants to acknowledge. Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age was fundamentally a place built around knowledge, scholarship, and intellectual exchange. And Mirage is fundamentally a game about parkouring across rooftops and stabbing people in the neck. There's a real friction there. The setting's identity and the franchise's genre obligations don't fully align, and some players felt that disconnect. The House of Wisdom deserves a game that lets you sit with its ideas, not just sprint across its rooftops. That said, the fact that this friction even exists is a testament to how well Mirage built its world. You don't feel that tension unless the setting is convincing enough to make you want more from it. And if you think cultural authenticity is the ceiling for what this franchise can achieve with environmental design, the final entry on this list pushes the boundaries in an entirely different direction. Assassin's Creed Shadows. Everyone expected Ghost of Tsushima. They expected serene cherry blossoms, perfectly manicured gardens, and that clean, cinematic version of Japan that Western games always default to. Assassin's Creed Shadows looked at all of that and said no, not even close. Shadows, released in 2025, finally delivers the setting the franchise was always going to tackle eventually. Sengoku period Japan, warring states, dramatic territorial conflict, a civilization tearing itself apart and rebuilding simultaneously, and the version of Japan that Ubisoft built for this game is not the postcard version. It's raw, dense, and genuinely challenging to exist in. Here's the thing. The most immediately striking detail about Shadows Japan is the terrain itself. Reviewers described it as hilly as hell, with thick, aggressive brush that actively fights you. This isn't decorative foliage. This is vegetation that impedes your movement, restricts your visibility, and fundamentally changes how you approach every encounter. One journalist described it as the only game they'd ever played where the world essentially tells you this is a dense forest, you can try to get through here, but not on your horse, and you're going to have a bad time. That's not scenery, that's a gameplay mechanic wearing a forest costume, and the seasonal weather system takes this even further. Inspired by Forza Horizon 4's approach, Shadows cycles through seasons that have real tactical consequences. A castle moat that's impassable in summer freezes solid in winter, creating an entirely new attack route that simply doesn't exist during warmer months. The landscape literally changes what's possible depending on when you show up. That's environmental design operating on a level this franchise has never attempted before. But Shadows isn't just wilderness and weather systems. The cultural detail layered throughout this world is staggering. Real locations appear as functional researched settings. Kiyomizudera Temple in Kyoto, the vast Koyasan Cemetery complex, the shrine of Itatehyozu Jinja in Himeji. These aren't generic Japanese aesthetic buildings copy-pasted across the map. They're genuine places rendered with genuine cultural weight, suggesting deep research and consultation rather than surface-level tourism. And the texture goes deeper than architecture. Bunraku Puppet shows populate town squares. Biwa players perform in the streets. Numerous shrines dot the landscape in ways that communicate the specific character of this historical period rather than some generalized feudal Japan fantasy. Every detail says something about the Sengoku era specifically, not Japan as a vague concept. Now, the honest criticism, the opening hours are heavily tutorialized and move slowly through Naoi's origin story before the world truly opens up. That pacing has frustrated some players, but once Shadows lets you loose, reviewers consistently describe the environmental sophistication as some of the best in the franchise's entire history. And here's why that matters. The philosophical achievement of Shadows is that it treats environmental design as inseparable from gameplay challenge. The beauty of the landscape and the danger of the landscape are the same thing. That frozen moat is gorgeous. It's also a tactical opportunity that could get you killed. That dense forest is breathtaking from a hilltop. it's also a death trap if you charge through it carelessly. That's a meaningful evolution for a franchise that spent years treating beautiful environments as backdrops to action rather than active participants in it. For over a decade, Assassin's Creed built increasingly stunning worlds that you ran through, climbed over, and occasionally stopped to admire. Shadows is the game where the world finally demands something back from you, where the environment isn't just beautiful to look at, it's beautiful because of what it asks you to do, and that feels like exactly where this franchise was always heading. Templar-style control didn't start with knights in armor. It started with a Greek cult that hijacked the most sacred oracle in the ancient world and used it to engineer a war between two entire civilizations. Today, I'm breaking down every single Templar rite in Assassin's Creed history, what they believed, how they operated, and how they fell, starting with the one that corrupted ancient Greece from the inside out, the Cult of Kosmos. The Cult of Kosmos worshipped a deity called Cosmos and operated throughout Greece during the 5th century BCE, right in the middle of the Peloponnesian War. And they weren't just watching the war unfold, they were running it. The cult controlled Greece through 7 distinct branches, with members embedded in Spartan military command, Athenian political circles, and everywhere in between. But the real power move was the Pythia. The Oracle of Delphi, the single most trusted voice in all of ancient Greece, was a puppet. Every prophecy, every divine revelation filtered through cult propaganda. If the oracle told you to go to war, you went to war, and the cult was writing the script. Here's where it gets complicated. The leader of all of this, the Ghost of Kosmos, was Aspasia of Miletus. Publicly, she was the most cultured woman in Athens, partner of Pericles, intellectual heavyweight. Privately, she was running a shadow government that had both Athens and Sparta compromised before the first spear was ever thrown. It took Cassandra systematically hunting down every single member across all 7 branches to finally end it. Every sage, every politician hiding behind a mask. She dismantled the entire organization piece by piece until only Aspasia remained. But the Cult of Kosmos was just one flavor of ancient conspiracy. The real predecessor to the Templars had already been operating for nearly 1,000 years before the cult even formed. The Order of the Ancients. Every single Templar rite you've ever encountered in this franchise traces back to one guy, one pharaoh. In 1334 BCE, Smenkhkar founded the Order of the Ancients with a single obsession: find Isu technology, worship the beings who made it, and use their power to rebuild a golden age on Earth. That's it. That's the mission statement that launched over 2,000 years of conspiracy, war, and control. One man looked at alien artifacts and thought, I can make this everyone's problem. And he did. The order didn't stay buried in Egypt. By the 5th century BCE, they had infiltrated the Achaemenid Empire so thoroughly that they were pulling strings behind consecutive emperors, including Darius I and Xerxes I. Military, religious, political structures all compromised. They weren't advising kings. They were wearing them like puppets. But here's the thing. The Order of the Ancients didn't go out in some dramatic final battle. It rotted, slowly. As Abrahamic religions replaced polytheistic Isu worship across the ancient world, the Order's entire theological foundation crumbled beneath it. Fewer people wanted to worship ancient alien gods when Christianity was offering a simpler deal. The last remnants in Britain were hunted down by Ivor around 878 CE, which should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. King Alfred of Wessex took what was left of the order, stripped out the Isu worship, wrapped it in Christian doctrine, and reformed it into something new, something that would survive another 1,000 years. The Order of the Ancients didn't die, it evolved. And that evolution is exactly what created the Templars as we know them, starting with their most iconic incarnation, the Levantine Templars. The entire Third Crusade was a treasure hunt. Thousands of soldiers marching across the Holy Land, bleeding and dying for God and country, and the guys running the show were actually looking for alien technology buried under Solomon's temple, which is, not ideal. Between 1189 and 1192, 9 leading Templars coordinated a covert search for the Apple of Eden, while the rest of the crusade raged around them as convenient cover. Grand Master Robert de Sablé positioned the entire military campaign as a framework for artifact recovery, using the fog of holy war to mask what was really a piece of Eden retrieval operation. Nobody questions why knights are digging through ancient ruins when there's a crusade happening. That's just called being thorough. But here's where the conspiracy gets genuinely unsettling. The The 9 Templar leaders didn't just include Knights Templar. The Grand Masters of the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Teutonic, supposedly rival military orders, were secretly among the 9. These organizations that publicly competed with each other, that had their own agendas and loyalties, were all answering to the same Shadow Council. The entire Crusader military apparatus was compromised from the top down. Altair systematically assassinated all 9 of them and recovered the apple before the Templars could secure it. But killing the leadership didn't kill the organization. De Sablé's successor, Armand Bouchard, immediately relocated operations to Cyprus, attempting to rebuild from the Mediterranean. Altair tracked him there too and put a blade in him, but Bouchard had already shipped the Templar treasury off the island before he died, so the man lost his life but saved the war chest. Every coin preserved for future reorganization. That 9-member council structure, by the way, became the Templar standard for centuries. And the resources Bouchard smuggled out, they didn't just disappear. They funded what came next, and what came next involved an underground city and a very angry group of Byzantine loyalists, the Ottoman Templars. Most Templar rights lost a war and regrouped somewhere else. The Byzantine Templars lost their entire civilization and decided to move underground, literally underground. After Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the remnants of the Byzantine Templar rite retreated into the subterranean city of Derinkuyu in Cappadocia and kept going. For decades, they operated in the shadows, biding their time until the events of Revelations in 1511. These people chose to live beneath the earth for over half a century rather than abandon their cause. Derinkuyu wasn't some makeshift bunker either. It was a full underground city, complete with training facilities, artifact storage, and enough infrastructure to sustain an entire organizational hierarchy without ever seeing sunlight. New recruits were brought in, trained in the dark, and indoctrinated with one singular purpose. And here's the thing. Their philosophical pitch was actually pretty compelling on the surface. They weren't framing themselves as power-hungry conspirators. They were the last guardians of a displaced Christian civilization, loyalists to a fallen empire who refused to let Byzantine culture die. Restoring Constantinople wasn't just a military objective, it was a sacred duty. That kind of conviction doesn't fade after a decade, it hardens over generations. The Byzantine Templars maintained networks of sympathizers embedded within Ottoman administrative and military structures, feeding intelligence back to Derinkuyu, while the Ottoman Empire carried on completely unaware that an entire Templar command was operating beneath their feet. They stockpiled Isu artifacts, trained operatives in total darkness, and planned their resurgence with the patience of people who genuinely believed they had all the time in the world. Then Ezio Auditore showed up and dismantled the whole thing. Decades of careful planning, an entire hidden city's worth of infrastructure, and one Italian assassin with Ottoman allies walked in and tore it apart. Some splinter groups survived to feed into later Templar operations, but the Byzantine Rite as a coherent organization was finished. All that patience, all that fanaticism, gone. Which is, not ideal. But if the Byzantine Templars were defined by patience and conviction, the next rite was defined by something far more dangerous: ambition with zero restraint. The Italian Rite. The literal pope was a Templar Grand Master. Let that sink in for a second. The most powerful religious figure on earth, the man who supposedly spoke for God, was secretly running an organization dedicated to stripping humanity of its free will using alien technology. And nobody knew. The Italian Rite was controlled by 3 powerful families: the Pazzi, the Barbarigo, and most prominently, the Borgia. Rodrigo Borgia clawed his way to the top of the Templar hierarchy as Grand Master, and then, because that apparently wasn't enough, he also became Pope Alexander VI. So now you've got one guy wielding the spiritual authority of the entire Catholic Church and the conspiratorial machinery of the Templar Order simultaneously, which is, not ideal for anyone who enjoys having thoughts of their own. But here's where it gets complicated. Rodrigo didn't even care about the Templar mission. Not really. His son Cesare ran the military. His daughter Lucrezia handled diplomacy. The entire operation was just a vehicle for Borgia family power. They treated the order like a family business, which, to be fair, it basically was at that point. The grand ideological crusade for humanity's future, replaced by how do we get more land and more money for the Borgias. Rodrigo eventually tried to hoard an apple of Eden entirely for himself, betraying even his own organization's goals. The Italian Rite didn't just rot from the outside, it rotted from the guy sitting in the big chair. Enter Ezio Auditore, who spent over 30 years of his life systematically tearing the whole thing apart. He assassinated their generals, recovered the Apple of Eden, and dismantled Borgia power base by base until the Italian right was effectively finished by the early 1500s. 3 decades of work to undo what one corrupt family built. That's dedication. But at least the Borgias kept their scheming to one continent. The Templars who set up shop in the Caribbean had much bigger ambitions and a much stranger target, the West Indies Rite. Most Templar rites are founded by shadowy figures operating behind the scenes. The West Indies Rite was founded by the actual governor of Cuba. Laureano de Torres y Ayala wasn't hiding in some underground bunker. He was running an entire colony in broad daylight while simultaneously building the Templar Order's first major foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And here's the thing. Torres wasn't interested in gold or land. He wanted the observatory, an ancient Isu installation buried in Long Bay, Jamaica, capable of surveilling literally anyone on Earth. Not a sword that controls minds, not an apple that bends wills. A building that lets you watch every single person on the planet whenever you want. That's not a piece of Eden. That's a piece of Eden on steroids. The Templars went from chasing shiny artifacts to pursuing infrastructure for global omniscience, which is, not ideal. For over 2 decades, Torres operated under the guise of legitimate Spanish colonial administration, infiltrating pirate crews, merchant guilds, and military installations across the Caribbean. The man controlled the most valuable trade zone in the world while secretly hunting for an alien surveillance camera. You have to respect the multitasking. But here's where it gets funny. The entire operation was ultimately dismantled by a drunk Welsh pirate who stumbled into the conspiracy by accident. Edward Kenway wasn't an assassin. He killed a man named Duncan Walpole, stole his clothes, and showed up to a Templar meeting pretending to be him because he heard there was money involved. That's the origin story. And somehow, this absolute disaster of a human being infiltrated the observatory in 1722 and killed Torres, inside the very installation the Grand Master had spent his entire career searching for. 20 years of meticulous planning ended by a pirate who originally just wanted a nice coat and some coin. Torres died in the one room he'd dreamed about his whole life. Poetry doesn't get much darker than that, but if the Caribbean Templars had ambitious plans for the New World, they were nothing compared to what came next on the American continent, the colonial rite. Haytham Kenway is one of the most fascinating characters in the entire franchise, because for the first 3 hours of Assassin's Creed 3, you genuinely believe you're playing as an assassin. You're not. You're building the Templar Order from scratch in the New World. In 1754, the British Rite dispatched Haytham to North America to search for Isu sites, and instead of just poking around and reporting back, he established the first permanent colonial rite hierarchy out of New York City, turning scattered Templar operatives into a coordinated machine. But here's where the colonial rite separated itself from every other branch we've talked about. They didn't just fight the assassins, they turned one. Shay Cormac was a full-blown member of the Colonial Brotherhood, who became so disillusioned with the assassins' reckless pursuit of Isu sites after accidentally triggering a catastrophic earthquake in Lisbon that killed tens of thousands that he defected entirely. The Templars weaponized him. Shay led a systematic campaign that eliminated nearly every colonial assassin, reducing the Brotherhood to basically one old man in a crumbling manor, which is, not ideal if you're an assassin. And Haytham wasn't done being clever. During the American Revolution, he positioned Templar agents on both sides of the conflict. Loyalists and revolutionaries alike had Templars embedded in their ranks. It didn't matter who won the war. The Templars would benefit either way. That level of strategic hedging is almost admirable if it weren't so deeply sinister. Then the tragedy kicks in. Connor Kenway, Retin Hanake-Tun, Haytham's own son, joined the Assassin Brotherhood and dedicated himself to dismantling everything his father built. A Templar Grandmaster killed by his own child fighting for the opposing ideology. That's not just a video game plot, that's Shakespeare with tomahawks. Haytham died, but here's the kicker. The colonial rite didn't die with him. It survived the revolution and rebranded as the American Rite. Connor killed the man, he didn't kill the machine, but if you think the Templars manipulated manipulating one revolution was impressive. Wait until you see what they pulled off in France, the French Rite. Francois Thomas Germain might be the single most important Templar in the entire Assassin's Creed franchise, and nobody gives him enough credit for it. Not because he was the strongest or most ruthless, but because his ideas literally built the modern order. Every corporate boardroom, every Abstergo subsidiary, every suit-wearing Templar agent in the modern day exists because of what this man set in motion in 18th century Paris. Here's the thing about Germain. He wasn't just a Grand Master, he was a sage, a reincarnation of the Yisu known as Aita, carrying memories from a civilization that predated humanity by thousands of years. And when he looked at the Templar order of his era, he saw rot. The order had become fat and comfortable, propping up aristocrats who served their own interests, while the Templar mission stagnated. Germain believed the entire system needed to burn, so he burned it, literally. Germain engineered the French Revolution. He manipulated economic conditions and food supplies across France, manufacturing mass starvation that would drive a nation to the breaking point. Then he gave them someone to blame, the aristocracy. Enter Maximilien de Robespierre, a provincial lawyer with radical ideas and zero awareness that he was a Templar puppet from day one. During the 9-month reign of terror, Robespierre's government arrested approximately 300,000 people and executed roughly 40,000 of them, all to prove a single philosophical point. Because the revolution wasn't about liberation, it was a conditioning experiment. Flood a society with so much chaos that the population begs for authoritarian control just to make it stop. Create the disease, then sell the cure. But Germain's real innovation was what came after. He argued that controlling kings was obsolete. Why own a monarch who can be overthrown when you can control the financial systems every government depends on? Replace thrones with boardrooms. Let people think they're free while you own everything they need to survive. That single ideological shift is the direct blueprint for Abstergo Industries. He didn't just run a Rite, he redesigned the entire order's playbook for the next 2 centuries, which is, not a bad legacy for a silversmith who talked to dead Isu in his head. But if the French Rite showed what happens when Templars weaponize ideology, the British Rite proved what happens when they weaponize industry itself. The British Rite. This is the oldest continuously organized Templar Rite in the entire franchise, and nobody gives it the credit it deserves. While other rites rose and fell like dominoes, the British Rite has been running since roughly 878 CE, when King Alfred of Wessex took the shattered Order of the Ancients and rebuilt them under a Christian framework. That's over 1,000 years of unbroken operation. And by the time Crawford Starrick took the reins as Grand Master in the mid-19th century, the British Rite didn't just influence London, it owned it, not figuratively, literally. Starrick's Industries had its fingers in every major commercial, governmental, and criminal enterprise in the city. Parliament, Templar-influenced, the police, compromised, the street gangs, a Templar outfit called the Blighters, operating as Starrick's personal enforcers. He didn't need an Apple of Eden or some ancient Isu superweapon, he just needed capitalism and a complete absence of morality, which is, not ideal. And here's where it stops being abstract conspiracy and starts being genuinely awful. Starrick's apparatus ran on child labor, kids working in Templar-controlled factories, producing the wealth that funded his empire. That's not some vague order through control philosophy. That's children being ground into profit margins so one man can own a city. Cool. Add that to the list, but the thing about building your empire on exploited people is that those people tend to get angry when someone finally hands them a weapon. Enter Jacob and Evie Fry. Instead of the usual lone wolf assassination campaign, Jacob went straight to London's underworld and built the Rooks, a gang designed to fight the Blighters on their own turf. Evie targeted Templar leadership directly. It was a two-front war, and Starrick's system crumbled because it depended on one thing he never accounted for: the people he was exploiting choosing to fight back. Starrick came closer to total urban dominion than arguably any other Grandmaster in history, and he lost it all because two 20-something assassins gave his victims a reason to stop being passive. But if Victorian London was a masterclass in Templar control, wait until you see what the Order pulled off in Russia, because that one reshaped an entire continent. The Russian Rite. Most Templar rites start with a bang. A Grand Master seizes power, builds an empire, and then an assassin shows up and ruins everything. The Russian Rite didn't work like that. The Russian Rite played the longest game in Templar history, and it actually won. And then it lost anyway, which is honestly the funniest possible outcome for an organization obsessed with control. Templar connections to Russian leadership stretch back to the 16th century through Ivan Ivanovich, son of Tsar Ivan the Terrible. But the Rite didn't consolidate real power until the late Russian Empire, when it began embedding itself into every layer of imperial governance: military leadership, aristocratic circles, administrative bureaucracy, the usual Templar playbook. But here's where it gets interesting. When the October Revolution hit in 1917, the Russian Rite picked both sides. They maintained agents within the imperial military while simultaneously embedding operatives within the Bolsheviks under Lenin. Regardless of who won, the Templars had people in the room. That's not hedging your bets. That's owning the casino. The real kicker comes after Lenin's death in 1924. Joseph Stalin was secretly controlled by the Templars. Stalin, a Templar puppet, the gulags, the purges, the absolute suffocation of individual freedom across the entire Soviet Union. That was the Templar dream made real. Total state control over every citizen, every institution, every thought. No other Rite in history actually achieved the endgame. The Russian Rite did, and then it fell apart. Here's the thing nobody talks about. The Russian Rite wasn't destroyed by assassins. No hooded figure climbed through a window and stabbed a Grand Master. The Rite eroded because totalitarianism is inherently self-destructive. The same mechanisms of absolute control that protected Templar interests prevented the flexibility needed to adapt when the system started cracking. By 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed under its own weight, and the Russian Rite collapsed with it. They built the perfect prison and then locked themselves inside. Every other Rite on this list got taken down by an assassin with a blade and a grudge. The Russian Rite proved that even if the Templars get everything they want, the thing they want doesn't work, which is, not ideal for an organization chasing that exact outcome for 3,000 years. But if the Russian Rite showed what happens when Templars win through government, the American Rite took notes and chose a completely different path. The American Rite. Every other Rite on this list has a moment, a dramatic fall, a Grand Master bleeding out on the floor while an assassin stands over them. The American Rite doesn't have that, and that's exactly what makes it the scariest one. After American independence, the colonial Rite didn't collapse. It just changed its name. The same organizational infrastructure that Haytham Kenway built, the same networks, the same ambitions, all of it carried over seamlessly into the newly independent nation. And then it grew, rapidly. Throughout the 19th century, the American Rite embedded itself into every major power structure the country had to offer. The executive branch, the legislative branch, intelligence agencies, military command, major financial institutions, industrial corporations. If it had influence, the Templars were inside it. The Civil War, Reconstruction, America's rise as a global superpower, all of these events played out with Templar fingerprints somewhere in the machinery, not always steering the wheel directly, but always close enough to nudge it. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember Germain's vision from the French Revolution? The idea that Templar power shouldn't flow through kings and governments, but through capitalism and corporate control. The American Rite is the one that actually finished that job. They took Germain's blueprint and built something he could only dream about: Abstergo Industries, a multinational corporate front so massive, so embedded in global commerce that it made traditional governmental infiltration look quaint by comparison. Why bother corrupting a senator when you can own the company that funds his campaign, employs his constituents, and manufactures the products in his house? And unlike the French Rite, which burned itself out in revolutionary chaos, or the British Rite, which got dismantled by two twins with a grudge, the American Rite just kept compounding. No assassin revolution toppled it. No single blade ended its reign. The American Brotherhood has chipped away at it for centuries, sure, taking out individual operatives, disrupting specific operations, but the structure itself, still standing, still growing, still the most powerful Templar organization on Earth heading into the 21st century, which is, not ideal, but the American Rite's greatest achievement isn't political influence or military reach. It's what they built to replace all of that. A corporation so powerful, it doesn't need governments anymore. And that corporation deserves its own conversation. Abstergo Industries. Every Templar organization we've covered had the same fatal flaw. They were run by people people who could be stabbed, poisoned, overthrown, or simply outlived. The Order of the Ancients died with its pharaohs. The Borgias collapsed when Ezio put a blade through the right necks. The colonial right crumbled when a father and son couldn't stop trying to kill each other. But in 1937, the Templars finally solved that problem. They built something you can't assassinate: a corporation. Abstergo Industries was officially founded as a pharmaceutical company, which is already the most Templar sentence ever written. But behind the lab coats and shareholder meetings, it was the culmination of 3,000 years of trial and error. Every lesson from every fallen right, every collapsed empire, every dead grandmaster, distilled into a single form that doesn't need a king, doesn't need a pope, and doesn't need to hide. It just needs quarterly earnings. Here's what makes Abstergo the scariest Templar entity in the entire franchise. It's partially legitimate. The corporation genuinely develops technology, genuinely produces pharmaceuticals, genuinely employs thousands of people who have zero idea they're working for a 3-millennium-old conspiracy. Every previous right had to pretend their control was for humanity's benefit. Abstergo doesn't have to pretend. It sells you products. It entertains you. It files taxes, but the endgame was never profit margins. Abstergo's ultimate objective was launching pieces of Eden into orbit, creating a satellite network capable of global mind control. A pharaoh worshipping alien gods in 1334 BCE started an ideological chain that, over 33 centuries, led to a pharmaceutical company putting mind control satellites in space. That's the Templar pipeline, from temples to thrones to corporate boardrooms to literal orbital weapons platforms. In 2012, the satellite launch was disrupted. Turns out no, that wasn't the end. Abstergo simply pivoted, shifted resources toward cultural influence, entertainment media, data collection, because that's the thing about corporations. You kill a grandmaster, the right falls apart. You disrupt a product launch, the company releases a press statement and moves on to the next fiscal quarter. And that's the real horror of Abstergo. It's the conspiracy that became so powerful it went public and nobody noticed. 3,000 years of secret warfare, and the final form isn't a hidden temple or an underground city. It's a logo on a building you walk past every day without looking up. The Templar Order has been shaping the world from the shadows for thousands of years, but not every branch got the memo on how to do it well. Some built empires, others built embarrassments. Today I'm ranking every single Templar order from worst to best, and we're starting at the very bottom with an order that controlled Constantinople and still managed to lose: the Byzantine Rite. The Byzantine Rite had everything. They controlled one of the most strategically important cities on the planet. They had operatives spread across multiple regions. They were pursuing the single most important objective in Templar history, and they lost because of family drama. Let me explain. After the Byzantine Empire collapsed in 1453, the remnants of the Byzantine Templars went underground. By the early 1500s, they had reorganized under Prince Ahmet, who had seized control of the Rite from the elderly Manuel Palaiologos. Manuel, the former leader, was pushed into a subordinate role and eventually retreated to a hidden Templar stronghold in Cappadocia. Their mission was massive: recover the Masyaf keys, unlock Altair's library, and locate the Grand Temple. That's arguably the most important Templar objective of the entire Renaissance era. But here's where it gets complicated. Ahmet wasn't just playing the Templar game, he was playing the Ottoman succession game at the same time. His masterstroke was a plan to kidnap his own nephew Suleiman during a palace exhibition, swoop in as the hero, and use that moment to legitimize his claim to the Ottoman throne. Sounds clever on paper. The problem is that it required literally everything to go perfectly. Every single moving piece had to land exactly right, including his enemies cooperating with his plan. Everything did not go perfectly. Ezio Auditore systematically dismantled the Byzantine Rite's operations across Constantinople. He tracked Manuel all the way to Cappadocia and killed him there, gutting the Rite's last fallback position. He exploited the existing feud between Ahmet and his brother Selim, turning Ottoman internal politics into a weapon. And here's the kicker: Ahmet wasn't even killed by an assassin. His own brother Selim caught up with him near the Galata Tower and threw him off a cliff. The assassins barely had to break a sweat. The fatal flaw was zero succession planning. The moment Ahmet's body hit the ground, the entire Byzantine Rite's infrastructure collapsed with him. An order that had spent decades rebuilding, that controlled key positions across Constantinople, crumbled instantly because they built everything around one man with a convoluted plan. They rank dead last because their defeat wasn't really the Brotherhood's doing. They were politically outmaneuvered by their own family and then finished off by Ottoman internal politics. Grand ambitions, zero strategic intelligence. But if you think losing to your own brother is embarrassing, wait until you see the Order that had a piece of Eden and still couldn't get it done. The West Indies Right. Laureano Torres might be the most tragic villain in Assassin's Creed history. Not tragic in a sympathetic way. Tragic in a watched a man build a house for 20 years and then trip into a wood chipper on move-in day kind of way. Here's the thing. The West Indies Right under Torres was genuinely dangerous. This wasn't some disorganized group fumbling around the Caribbean hoping to stumble into power. Torres ran a tight operation with a singular obsession: the Observatory, a first civilization structure capable of tracking any human being on the planet through their blood. Think about that for a second. Global surveillance centuries before satellites existed. That's not a small prize. That's a world-ending level of control. And Torres wasn't messing around trying to get it. In 1716, the Right acquired a fragment of Eden and immediately assigned a crew of named captains to protect it. Christopher Condent, Francis Hume, Benjamin Hornigold, John Barnes, each one a dedicated operative with a specific role in the larger plan. This wasn't improvisation, this was infrastructure. But where the West Indies Right really proved themselves was on the battlefield. Between 1716 and 1717, they launched an aggressive campaign against every single assassin bureau in the Caribbean. They didn't just harass the Brotherhood, they nearly wiped it out. They even marshaled a British army contingent under Lawrence Prince and came dangerously close to overrunning the Tulum fortress itself. That's the Assassins' main stronghold in the region, and the Templars almost took it by force. You don't do that without serious military coordination. So when Torres finally located and accessed the observatory in 1722, it felt like the payoff of a generation's worth of intelligence work, resource expenditure, and strategic patience across the entire Caribbean theater. Over 2 decades of effort, all converging on a single moment. Edward Kenway killed him approximately 30 seconds later, before Torres could use the observatory for anything, before a single name was tracked, before one strategic benefit was realized. 20+ years of work gone, and it gets worse. Master Assassin Rona Dinsmore then systematically prevented any Templar reorganization in Havana, ensuring the Right effectively collapsed with its Grand Master. They rank above the Byzantines because their military operations were legitimately effective. The Bureau purges and the Tulum assault prove real operational competence. But the observatory debacle is one of the most spectacular strategic anticlimaxes in the entire franchise. Torres built the perfect machine, drove it to the finish line, and then the engine fell out. But if you think dying 30 seconds after your life's work paid off is bad, wait until you see what happens when Templars actually get to keep their prize. The French Right, Francois Thomas Germain, is the most underrated Grandmaster in the entire franchise, and it's not even close. Most fans barely talk about him. But what he actually pulled off? It makes the Borgias look like they were playing checkers. Here's the thing about Germain. He wasn't just another Templar climbing the ranks. He was a sage, a reincarnation of the Isu known as Aita, which means he had literal ancient memories rattling around in his skull. While every other Grandmaster was working from Templar doctrine, Germain was operating with a cheat code baked into his DNA. His rise to power was surgical. In May 1789, Germain assassinated the sitting Grandmaster Francois de la Serre with a poisoned silver pin. Not a battle, not a siege, a single precise strike. 1 pin, 1 dead Grand Master, total control of the French Right overnight. But here's where it gets interesting. Germain didn't just want power, he wanted to fundamentally rewrite how the Templar Order operated. He argued that propping up kings and aristocrats was a dead end. Instead, strip the aristocracy of their power, install capitalism, and let economic systems do the controlling for you. People chasing money are predictable. People chasing money are manageable. He weaponized Enlightenment economics as a long-term control mechanism. And honestly, the logic is terrifyingly sound. His method of implementation was the French Revolution itself. The entire thing. He manipulated revolutionary and royalist factions simultaneously, controlling radical elements through Templar agent Maximilien de Robespierre. The revolution killed hundreds of thousands of people. That wasn't collateral damage, That was the point. Germain used an entire nation's upheaval as his personal Templar tool, and when Arno finally cornered him, Germain wielded a Sword of Eden in the temple dungeon for the endgame. The scale of that ambition is staggering. The Borgias wanted Rome, Starrick wanted London. Germain wanted to reshape the very structure of how nations govern their people. That's a different league entirely. But his fatal flaw was exactly what you'd expect from a genius who thought he was smarter than everyone in the room. He executed dissenters immediately. Zero tolerance for internal opposition. That created an ideologically pure inner circle, sure, but also an incredibly brittle one. The moment Arno started picking off key members, there was nobody left who could adapt. Germain built a machine with no redundancy, and that's why he ranks here instead of higher. Despite nearly reshaping an entire nation's government, his operation collapsed. Arno killed him before the new order could consolidate, and the French right had zero infrastructure left to continue his vision. The genius was undeniable, but almost succeeding does a lot of heavy lifting when your entire inner circle dies with you. Still, if you think using a national revolution as a Templar weapon is ambitious, wait until you see what the next order managed to build with far less drama and far more staying power: the Order of the Ancients. No other entry on this list even comes close to this kind of longevity. The Order of the Ancients operated continuously for nearly 2,200 years. Let that sink in. While every other Templar faction on this list measured their influence in decades, maybe a century if they were lucky, the Ancients were pulling strings across entire civilizations. It started around 1334 BCE, when Egyptian pharaoh Smenkhkare founded the order with one obsession: find, understand, and exploit the technology left behind by the first civilization. These people were hunting Isu artifacts before the word Templar even existed as a concept. Before the Crusades, before the Brotherhood, before any of it. They were the original blueprint, and they didn't stay in Egypt. By the late 6th century BCE, the order had spread its influence deep into Persia, directly manipulating Achaemenid kings like Darius I and Xerxes I. That means their fingerprints are on some of the most consequential military campaigns in the ancient world. The wars you learned about in school had puppet masters operating behind the curtain. But here's where it gets personal. In 49 BCE, the Order attempted to unlock the Siwa vault hidden beneath the Temple of Amun. To do it, they kidnapped the Medjay Bayek and his son Kemu, trying to force them to open the vault. During the struggle, Bayek accidentally stabbed his own son. A child killed not as a planned sacrifice, but as collateral damage in a moment of chaos the Order caused, and that single act of senseless tragedy created Bayek's entire vendetta, which led directly to the founding of the Hidden Ones, the direct predecessor to the Assassin Brotherhood. The Ancients literally created their own worst enemy. Now here's the twist nobody sees coming. In 878 CE, King Alfred of Wessex played the longest game in the franchise. He used the Viking Ivor as an unwitting weapon, feeding information and manipulating events so that Ivor would systematically eliminate the Order's cells across England. One by one, they fell. And most players assumed Alfred was just a heroic English king trying to save his people. He wasn't. Alfred didn't destroy the Order, he absorbed it. He took their infrastructure, Christianized their ideology, purged the pagan elements he found distasteful, and rebuilt the remnants into what would eventually become the formal Knights Templar. The Ancients didn't die, they evolved. Every single Templar faction that comes after this point on our list exists because Alfred took a Bronze Age Egyptian secret society and gave it a cross to carry. So why did they land in the middle of the ranking? Because despite 2,200 years of continuous operation, they never actually achieved their core goal. The Isu technology they were obsessed with remained beyond their grasp, and ultimately they didn't go out on their own terms. They were co-opted, absorbed, redefined by someone smarter playing a longer game. Longevity without victory is just endurance. But if you think getting absorbed from within is bad, wait until you see what happens when a Templar order tears itself apart on purpose. The colonial right. This is the Templar order that should have won, not came close to winning, not had a decent shot, should have won. And the fact that they didn't is one of the most tragic stories in the entire franchise. The colonial right was formally established in 1758 when Shay Cormac was inducted by Grand Master Hatham Kenway, And if you know anything about Assassin's Creed, you know that Haytham isn't just another Templar leader, he's arguably the most capable, most principled Grandmaster the Order has ever produced. The man genuinely believed in what the Templars stood for, not power for power's sake, not control for ego. Haytham wanted order because he thought it was the only way to protect people from themselves. And honestly, playing through his sequences, it's hard to disagree with him. Under Haytham's leadership, the colonial right became a political and military machine operating primarily out of New York City, with a network sophisticated enough to influence both sides of the 7 Years' War. They weren't just playing one faction, they were playing all of them. But here's where it gets genuinely terrifying for the assassins. Shay Cormac, a former assassin who defected to the Templars, launched a 6-year purge campaign from 1757 to 1763 that nearly eradicated the colonial brotherhood entirely. 6 years of systematic hunting. The assassin presence in the colonies was reduced to almost nothing. Achilles Davenport was left broken and alone. The Brotherhood wasn't weakened, it was functionally destroyed. By January 1774, the Colonial Rights Leadership Council was stacked. Haytham, Charles Lee, William Johnson, John Pitcairn, Thomas Hickey, Benjamin Church. These weren't shadowy figures hiding in basements. They were embedded at every level of pre-revolutionary colonial society: military officers, political operatives, merchants with influence stretching across the entire eastern seaboard. Their master play was nothing less than controlling the outcome of the American Revolutionary War itself, positioning to build a new world order under Templar governance in the emerging nation. They had the military victory, they had the political infrastructure, they had the assassins on life support. Everything was in place. And then Connor happened. Haytham's own son, raised by the assassins. One man, operating out of a crumbling homestead with a brotherhood that barely existed, dismantled the entire colonial leadership one by one. Johnson, Pitcairn, Hickey, Church, Lee, and finally, Haytham himself. The colonial right achieved near total dominance over the assassins and still lost because of a single determined opponent who happened to share his Grandmaster's blood. That's what makes this one hurt. The West Indies right failed because they were outmaneuvered. The colonial right failed because of irony. Haytham's bloodline, the very thing that should have secured his legacy, became the instrument of his destruction. It says something profound about the limits of Templar ideology, that you can control nations and armies and still lose everything to something as uncontrollable as family. They rank 5th because their military success against the Brotherhood was genuinely unmatched at a regional level. But their political ambitions collapsed under the weight of a tragedy that no amount of planning could have prevented. And if that doesn't sum up the Templar experience, nothing does. But if the colonial right's downfall was personal, the next order's collapse was ideological, and it reshaped an entire nation in the process: the British Right. Crawford Starrick didn't run London like a Templar, he ran it like a CEO. By 1868, Starrick had built what might be the most impressive Templar operation in the entire franchise, and it looked nothing like the secret societies that came before it. No hidden rituals in underground chambers, no ancient conspiracies whispered between robed figures. Starrick's British Right was a machine, a corporate empire with a body count. Here's how it worked. Starrick controlled London through a network of 7 specialized lieutenants, each one managing a distinct sector of the city's infrastructure: gangs, industry, transportation, medicine, finance. Every class, every borough, every major system that kept Victorian London functioning had a Templar sitting at the top of it. Intelligence assessments from the period called it the most sophisticated Templar infrastructure known in the Western world. And honestly, that tracks. This wasn't a shadow organization hiding inside the British Empire. This was a shadow government operating in plain sight as the British Empire. Starrick didn't need to infiltrate institutions. He owned them. But here's where it gets interesting. Starrick's endgame wasn't just economic control. Beneath Buckingham Palace sat a Shroud of Eden, a piece of Eden with healing and enhancing properties that could fundamentally alter whoever wore it. Starrick's plan was to use the Shroud to neutralize British heads of church and state, including Queen Victoria herself, then position himself as the only person capable of restoring order to the chaos he created. Classic Templar playbook, but executed at a scale nobody else in the franchise ever attempted. And when Starrick actually got the Shroud, it wasn't theoretical. He gained enhanced strength and regenerative abilities powered powerful enough to overpower both Jacob and Evie Fry simultaneously in direct combat. For a brief, genuinely terrifying moment, Starrick became one of the most dangerous enemies in the entire series. Two trained assassins fighting together couldn't put him down, which makes what happened to his empire even more ironic. The British Right's fatal flaw was Starrick himself, specifically his complete inability to adapt. When the Fry twins arrived in London and started dismantling his infrastructure borough by borough, Starrick's response was essentially nothing. Each lieutenant fell, each sector collapsed, and Starrick never pivoted, never restructured, never deployed resources from intact sectors to reinforce crumbling ones. He just watched his machine break down one gear at a time. Some fans have argued that Reginald Birch would have handled the Fry problem with far more tactical flexibility, and honestly, it's hard to disagree. The ranking here is straightforward. On pure infrastructure and institutional reach, the British Right dwarfs almost everything else in the franchise. Starrick's London operation makes the Colonial Right look like a startup. But all of that power was entirely dependent on one man, with zero resilience below him. Remove Starrick, and the whole thing collapses overnight. A monopoly with muscle is still a monopoly, and monopolies are brittle. But if you think a corporate villain running London is ambitious, wait until you see what the Templars built when they had an entire ancient civilization's technology to work with. The Roman Right. Rodrigo Borgia didn't become Pope because he found God. He didn't even believe in God. He became Pope Alexander VI in 1492 for one reason and one reason only. The Vatican was sitting on top of a staff of Eden, and the papacy was the only key that could get him close to it. Let that sink in. The most powerful religious position in the Western world, and a Templar used it as a lockpick. But Rodrigo wasn't working alone. His son, Cesare, was the operational arm of the Roman Right, and he was arguably even more terrifying. In January 1500, Cesare led the siege of Monteriggioni, the Italian Brotherhood's actual headquarters. He captured the base and seized their Apple of Eden in a single afternoon. One military operation. The assassins lost their home and a major piece of Eden before dinner. That's not a battle. That's a heist with cannons. And Cesare didn't stop there. He systematically tore through central Italy, deposing or eliminating every local lord in his path. Giovanni Sforza was removed from Pesaro. Pandolfo Malatesta was driven out of Rimini. Young Astore, the third Manfredi, murdered at Castel Sant'Angelo. By August 1503, Cesare controlled Rome through all four districts: Antico, Campania, Centro, and Vaticano, each one locked down with Borgia towers and military captains stationed throughout the city. He didn't just influence Rome, he owned it. Meanwhile, Rodrigo was playing an even bigger game. In 1499, he wielded the papal staff of Eden and attempted to open the Vatican vault hidden beneath the Sistine Chapel. This was a direct attempt to access first civilization technology at the highest level any Templar had ever attempted. No other Right in the franchise's history had a leader physically standing inside a precursor site with an artifact in hand, trying to unlock the secrets of the Essu. That's how far the Roman Right reached, so why aren't they number one? Here's where it gets complicated. Modern Templar historians within the lore actually refer to the Borgia period, roughly 1476 through the 1520s, as the Dark Age of the Order, and that label didn't come from the assassins, it came from other Templars. Their own successors looked back at Rodrigo and Cesare and said these two set us back, because despite holding the most powerful Templar seat in franchise history, the Borgias used it almost entirely for personal gain, dynasty over ideology, ego over order, and this is where the fan debate gets genuinely interesting. The community has argued for years about who was actually worse, Rodrigo or Cesare. Rodrigo is the philosophically depraved one, a man who manipulated his way to the papacy while believing in absolutely nothing. No faith, no ideology, not even the Templar cause really, just power for power's sake. He's cold, calculating, and intellectually corrupt in a way that makes your skin crawl. Cesare is the opposite kind of dangerous. He's hot, territorial, obsessive. He didn't care about precursor vaults or ancient knowledge. He wanted to conquer. He wanted to be seen conquering. Every city he took, every lord he deposed, it was about building his own empire with his own name on it. Some fans argue that makes him more dangerous in practice because Rodrigo schemed while Cesare actually moved armies. The Roman Right ranks second because the raw achievements are undeniable. Papal authority, multiple pieces of Eden held simultaneously, direct military and political control of Rome. No other regional order in the entire franchise managed all three at once, but the self-serving corruption that defined both Borgias ultimately undermined everything the order was supposed to stand for, and their own people knew it. They had everything, and they wasted it on themselves. But even the Borgias at their worst pale in comparison to the sheer scale of what the number one right accomplished. Abstergo Industries. Every Templar order on this list controlled a city, a country, maybe a region. Abstergo controls the concept of information itself, and that's not an exaggeration. It's the literal business model. Founded in 1937 by a coalition of wealthy bankers, politicians, and industrialists, Abstergo was the first Templar organization in history to use capitalism as its primary weapon. No swords, no secret handshakes in candlelit chambers, just a publicly traded corporation with a board of directors, quarterly earnings reports, and a pharmaceutical division that happened to be developing mind-reading technology in the basement. Here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. Warren Vidic, director of the Animus Project and Inner Sanctum member from roughly 2003 to 2012, built the machine that could access human genetic memory. Think about what that actually means. The Templars could now archaeologically excavate the entire history of the Assassin Brotherhood from the inside, using their enemies' own bloodlines as a search engine. Every hidden bureau, every piece of Eden location, every secret the Assassins had protected for millennia, all accessible through a descendant strapped into a chair. The 2012 kidnapping of Desmond Miles was the proof of concept. They needed first civilization location data locked in his genetic memory, and the operation was sophisticated enough that his captivity was framed as voluntary research participation. Vidic was killed by Desmond in December 2012, but the project had already yielded exactly what they needed. But here's the kicker. Abstergo didn't just use the Animus for intelligence gathering. They launched entertainment products, games, films, interactive experiences, all built from Animus-derived genetic memories. They took the actual lived experiences of assassins, repackaged them as consumer entertainment, and sold them back to the public. Let that sink in. They turned assassin history into Templar propaganda, reframing their enemies as historical relics, while positioning Templar ideology as progress, their own enemies' memories, funding further operations. That is genuinely the most clever piece of world building in the entire franchise, and the organization didn't collapse after Vidic's death, not even close. By 2013, Juhani Otzoberg had risen to Master Templar and Inner Sanctum. By 2016, he'd become the Black Cross, the Order's internal enforcement role, a position that dates back centuries. The machine kept running because it was designed to survive the loss of any individual. That's what separates Abstergo from every other order on this list. Crawford Starrick dies, London falls. Hatham dies, the colonial right crumbles. Vidic dies, and Abstergo posts record quarterly earnings. Their ultimate endgame was the Akashic Satellite Plexus, with its Abstergo component designed to transmit pieces of Eden influence through satellite infrastructure. Global mind control, not over a city, not over a nation, over every human being with a signal. Removing the variable of human resistance entirely, they rank first not because they've won, they haven't. They rank first because no other Templar order in history has operated at this scale simultaneously. Global corporate infrastructure, state-level political influence, proprietary mind control technology, and a media apparatus actively rewriting the historical record in real time. Every other order on this list was regional. Abstergo is everywhere. And remember the Order of the Ancients. Pharaoh Smenkhkare founding a secret society in 1334 BCE to exploit Isu technology and control humanity from the shadows. This is what that became. It just took 3,300 years to reach its final form. That's every major Templar order ranked from the Byzantine Rites' spectacular political self-destruction all the way up to a corporation that turned your entertainment habits into a control mechanism. The franchise's real argument isn't that Templars are evil, it's that every iteration of this ideology, from Bronze Age Egypt to modern London, finds a new shape to fit the era, and that's genuinely unsettling. Every major faction in gaming has an origin story, but the Assassin Brotherhood's is uniquely backwards. It wasn't founded on philosophy or ambition. It was founded on revenge against one man so dangerous that killing him accidentally created an entire centuries-long war. So today we're breaking down the deadliest Templars in Assassin's Creed history, ranked by how much damage they actually did to the Brotherhood. And we're starting with the man who brought the whole thing into existence. Flavius Metellus. Here's a fun paradox for you. The first entry on a list of the deadliest Templars is a guy who technically wasn't even a Templar. Flavius Metellus was a member of the Order of the Ancients, the Proto-Templar organization operating in Ptolemaic Egypt around 49 BCE. Some fans will argue that makes him ineligible entirely, and that's a fair debate. The Order of the Ancients and the Templar Order share ideology, goals, and a direct lineage, but they're not the same organization in the same way that a caterpillar isn't a butterfly. Same creature, just earlier. But let's talk about why Flavius matters. This man was the highest-ranking military official in Egypt during Cleopatra's reign. He controlled military forces and temple networks across the entire Nile Delta. But then he got his hands on the Apple of Eden, an Isu artifact containing precursor knowledge no human in that era had any business possessing. He wasn't just a general anymore. He was a general with a reality-warping superweapon, which is, not ideal. Bayek of Siwa killed him. Standard assassin stuff. Except the Assassin Brotherhood didn't exist yet. There was no creed. There were no hidden blades being passed down through generations. There was just a grieving father who wanted the people responsible for his son's death to stop breathing. Bayek's revenge against Flavius and the Order of the Ancients is literally what sparked the creation of the entire Brotherhood. Every assassin who ever lived exists because of what this man did, so Flavius sits in this impossible position. He's simultaneously the least impactful Templar on this list, because you can't threaten a brotherhood that doesn't exist, and the most consequential, because his cruelty is the reason it does. He built the fire that burned his own house down. He just wasn't alive to see it. But if a man who accidentally created the assassins is where we're starting, wait until you meet the first Grand Master who had to fight them head-on, Robert de Sablé. Every franchise has its first real villain. Not the tutorial boss, not the forgettable henchman you forget by the credits, the one who sets the standard. For Assassin's Creed, that's Robert de Sablé, and every Grand Master that came after him has been living in his shadow whether they know it or not. Robert was the Grand Master of the Knights Templar during the Third Crusade in 1191, and he wasn't sitting in some tower giving orders. He was running military operations across Acre, Jerusalem, and Arsuf simultaneously during an active war, while also pursuing Isu artifacts that most people wouldn't even understand for another 8 centuries. The man was multitasking on a level that would make a modern CEO cry into their quarterly earnings report. Here's the thing about Robert, though. He was genuinely dangerous in a way that the first game doesn't always get credit for conveying. This wasn't a schemer hiding behind politics. He was a trained Crusader knight with territorial control over 3 major cities in the Holy Land, backed by an army that answered directly to him. When Altair came for him, Robert didn't panic. He fought back, multiple times, across multiple encounters. The guy literally sent a body double to buy himself time because he knew the assassins were coming, and he still almost won. But Altair did kill him. At the Battle of Arsuf, at the absolute height of Robert's military power, the Brotherhood put a blade in the most powerful Templar alive. And that moment matters more than people realize. It was proof of concept. The first time the assassins demonstrated that they could reach the very top of the Templar chain and cut the head off. Before Robert, that was theoretical. After Robert, it was a documented capability. His death destabilized Templar operations across the entire Levant for years, which sounds impressive until you realize that's also his ceiling. Robert's power was regional, the Holy Land, not the world. He was a military giant operating in a very specific sandbox, and once that sandbox collapsed, so did his legacy's immediate reach. Still, he's the original, the template, the Templar, that every Grand Master after him gets compared to, fairly or not. He earned that. But if you think a Crusade-era warlord with a regional grip on power is scary, wait until you meet the Templar who was secretly running an entire country for decades, Alfred the Great. Most people know Alfred the Great as the guy who burned some cakes. Maybe you know him as the king who saved Wessex from the Vikings. What you probably don't know is that Assassin's Creed Valhalla turned him into a secret Templar puppet master, and honestly, it's one of the wildest swings the franchise has ever taken. Here's the setup. Alfred was king of Wessex from 871 to 899 CE, and during that time, he did something nobody else had managed. He stopped the Viking conquest of Anglo-Saxon England dead in its tracks. Law reform, cultural standardization, a unified military response to Danish invasions. The man basically laid the foundations that his son Edward and grandson Athelstan would later use to unify England under a single crown. and according to Valhalla, he did all of it with Templar philosophy running underneath every decision like plumbing. The genius of Alfred's portrayal is that he never needed to stab anyone. His weapon was bureaucracy. While other Templars on this list were out there personally dueling assassins and seizing artifacts, Alfred was writing legal codes and restructuring governance. He was building the scaffolding of a Templar-aligned nation-state, one that his descendants would finish constructing. His threat wasn't a blade. It was an institution, and that's what makes him so dangerous in the long view. Alfred's reign lasted nearly 3 decades, which gave the order sustained, uninterrupted influence over a kingdom's development. The laws, the church relationships, the military infrastructure, all of it carried Templar fingerprints. By the time anyone in the Brotherhood could have noticed, the architecture was already load-bearing. You can't assassinate a legal system. Now, I have to be honest, the fan reception to this reveal was, let's say, mixed. A lot of people flat out rejected it. Alfred the Great is one of the most celebrated monarchs in English history, and slapping a Templar badge on him felt, to many, like a step too far. The evidence is thin and isolated entirely to Valhalla's narrative. There's no corroboration from other games, no broader lore support. It's basically one game's word against the entire franchise's silence. But whether you buy it or not, the implication is massive. If Alfred was a Templar, then the political groundwork the Order exploited for the next 1,000 years in England wasn't an accident. It was designed. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's urban planning. But if you think a king playing the long game is unsettling, wait until you meet someone who was pulling strings in ancient Greece centuries before Alfred was even born. Aspasia. Most of the Templars on this list killed people. Aspasia did something worse. She built the idea that made all of them possible. Operating in Athens during the 440s BCE, Aspasia wasn't a soldier, a general, or even a traditional political leader. She was an orator, a philosopher, and a political advisor who happened to be pulling the strings of Athenian democracy from behind the curtain. And in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, she's revealed as one of the founding architects of the Proto-Templar Order, the Cult of Cosmos. That's not a regional chapter, that's the entire foundation. The blueprint that every Grandmaster, every rite, every Abstergo boardroom meeting would eventually trace back to. Here's what makes Aspasia genuinely terrifying. She predates the Assassin Brotherhood's official founding by roughly 4 centuries. Bayek and Aya hadn't even been born yet. The Hidden Ones didn't exist. There was literally zero organized resistance to what she was building. She planted seeds in the fertile soil of Western civilization's most influential city-state, and those seeds wouldn't fully bloom for hundreds of years. That's not a plan. That's a geological event, and she did all of it without ever picking up a weapon. Cassandra, the Eagle-Bearer, the demigod who carved through hundreds of cultists across Greece, never truly defeats Aspasia in the main narrative. You can confront her, sure, you can have a conversation, but there's no boss fight, no dramatic assassination, because Aspasia's power was too diffuse to stab. She operated entirely through influence, manipulation, and the strategic distribution of Isu artifact knowledge to future generations of the Order. You can't assassinate an ideology. You can only kill the person holding it, and by the time you find them, they've already passed it on. She's also one of the vanishingly rare female leaders in the Templar hierarchy across the entire franchise. A woman wielding that level of organizational power in a series that almost exclusively gives those roles to men. And she did it in ancient Greece, which, wasn't exactly known for its progressive gender politics. Now, the community is split on her. Some fans think she's brilliant lore expansion, proof that the Templar conspiracy runs deeper than anyone imagined. Others think she's a retcon that stretches established Templar history past its breaking point. Both sides have a point, honestly, but love her or hate her, the woman essentially wrote the operating manual for a shadow organization that would dominate human history for the next 2,500 years. That's a resume. But if you think ideological manipulation is dangerous, wait until you meet the Templar who tried to control an entire empire through pure industrial capitalism. Crawford Starrick. Most Templars throughout history needed armies, fleets, or ancient artifacts to control people. Crawford Starrick just needed a balance sheet. The Grand Master of the British Templars in 1868 realized something that none of his predecessors ever fully grasped. You don't need to kill assassins if you can make sure nobody in their city can afford to eat. And honestly, it's kind of genius. Starrick didn't conquer London, he bought it. Every factory, every rail line, every political institution, every gang operating in the streets, all of it fed back into a single man sitting in a leather chair somewhere, sipping tea while an entire city's working class slowly suffocated under his thumb. He controlled the Blighters, Templars, a gang that enforced his will at street level. He controlled parliament through financial leverage. He controlled medicine, transportation, and industry. If you lived in London in 1868, you were either working for Crawford Starrick or starving because of him. This is a guy who turned capitalism itself into a weapon. Forget the Apple of Eden, forget Pieces of Eden, forget ancient precursor technology. Starrick had monopolies, and in the Industrial Revolution, that was arguably more dangerous than any Isu artifact ever created. The working conditions in his factories were brutal. The poverty he manufactured was deliberate. He wasn't just oppressing people as a side effect of his ambitions. Oppression was the business model. But here's where it gets complicated, because for all of that infrastructure, for all of that strangling, suffocating control over one of the most powerful cities on Earth, Starrick got taken down remarkably fast. Jacob and Evie Fry roll into London, form the Rooks to challenge his blighters, start liberating boroughs, dismantling his operations piece by piece, and within what feels like a weekend, the guy's done. Dead in a cathedral, and fans noticed. The community has argued for years that Starrick was one of the most underdeveloped grandmasters in the entire franchise, not because the concept was bad, the concept was terrifying. A Templar who doesn't need a sword because he owns every sword factory in the country? That's a nightmare. But the execution never matched the premise. His defeat felt too clean, too quick, too easy for a man whose tentacles supposedly reached every corner of English society. He nearly strangled an entire city into submission, but couldn't handle two 20-something twins with hidden blades and a grappling hook. It's the biggest gap between threat level and actual difficulty in the series. On paper, Starrick should be one of the most dangerous Templars who ever lived. In practice, he's a mid-boss with great dialogue. But if Starrick's problem was being underdeveloped, the next Templar on our list has the opposite issue. His story is so layered and so tragic that most players don't even know the full extent of it. Daniel Cross. Every Templar on this list so far fought the Brotherhood with swords, armies, or political schemes. Daniel Cross did it with a single hidden blade, and that blade nearly ended everything. Here's the thing about Daniel Cross. He wasn't some lifelong Templar loyalist. He was an assassin, a real one. He trained with the Brotherhood, earned their trust, climbed their ranks, and eventually stood face to face with the Mentor, the highest-ranking assassin leader in the entire modern era. And then he killed him. One strike. The hidden blade buried in the Mentor's throat. The most important assassin on the planet dead. But here's where it gets genuinely tragic. Daniel didn't choose to do this. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray everyone he'd ever fought alongside. Abstergo Industries had gotten to him years earlier through repeated animus conditioning, essentially reprogramming his brain without his knowledge. They turned him into a sleeper agent, a weapon buried inside the Brotherhood's own ranks, waiting to go off. And he had zero idea. He walked into that room believing he was a loyal assassin. He walked out a murderer. Hey Daniel, quick question, why'd you stab the Mentor? I don't know. Cool. That's also a thing that happened. The assassination alone would have been devastating enough. Cutting the head off any organization creates chaos, but what followed was infinitely worse. The Mentor's death triggered the Great Purge, a coordinated global operation in which Abstergo systematically hunted down and eliminated assassin cells worldwide. Every safe house, every network, every hidden bureau that the Brotherhood had spent centuries building, Abstergo already had the intelligence. They just needed the Brotherhood to be leaderless and disorganized long enough to strike. And strike they did. Cell after cell went dark. Assassins who had operated in secret for decades were found and killed. The global infrastructure of the Brotherhood didn't just take a hit, it collapsed. By the time Desmond Miles entered the Animus in 2012, the modern Brotherhood was barely functional. A handful of operatives running on fumes, hiding in warehouses, operating with the organizational power of a book club that forgot to renew its library card. Daniel Cross didn't personally kill every one of those assassins, but he didn't have to. That's what makes him so uniquely dangerous on this list. He wasn't a general commanding armies. He wasn't a grand master playing political chess. He was a single point of failure that the Templars engineered and inserted directly into the Brotherhood's heart. One man, one kill, and the entire modern assassin network began bleeding out. No other Templar on this list achieved that kind of efficiency. Armies couldn't do what Daniel Cross did. Decades of open warfare couldn't do what Daniel Cross did. Abstergo just needed one broken man in the right room at the right time. But if Daniel Cross represents the Templars weaponizing a single person to devastating effect, the next entry on this list weaponized an entire revolution. Francois Thomas Germain. Most Templars fight the assassins. Germain made an entire country do it for him. The Grand Master of the French Templar Order from 1789 to 1794 didn't raise an army or send agents door to door. he did something infinitely worse. He hijacked the French Revolution, turned millions of ordinary citizens into unwitting instruments of Brotherhood annihilation, and then sat back while history did his dirty work. The Reign of Terror wasn't just political chaos. It was a targeted assassin extermination campaign, wearing the mask of populist justice. Here's how it worked. Germain infiltrated and effectively controlled the Committee of Public Safety, pulling Robespierre's strings like the man was a marionette with a very fancy wig. Under the banner of rooting out enemies of the Republic, Germain's network systematically identified, hunted, and executed high-ranking assassins across France. Brotherhood leadership, operatives, informants, support networks. All of them fed into the guillotine's schedule alongside thousands of ordinary citizens. And that was the genius of it. Every dead assassin just looked like another casualty of revolutionary fervor. Not a targeted kill, not a Templar operation, just Tuesday in Paris. His operational cells stretched across Paris, Versailles, and deep into the provincial regions. This wasn't a single city power grab. Germain had infrastructure everywhere the revolution touched, which was basically everywhere. The French assassin Brotherhood, which had operated for centuries, was nearly wiped off the map in under 5 years. Their safe houses were compromised. Their leaders were dead or in hiding. Their recruits were too terrified to identify themselves, because doing so meant the same blade that was killing aristocrats would find them next. And the body count among assassin leadership specifically was staggering. Germain didn't just weaken the Brotherhood's French chapter, he dismantled it, systematically, methodically, like a man checking items off a grocery list, except every item was a human being. The few assassins who survived did so by essentially ceasing to function as assassins at all, going so deep underground they might as well have not existed. What makes Germain arguably the most dangerous Templar on this entire list is scale versus effort. Other Grandmasters threw armies at the Brotherhood and achieved partial victories. Germain weaponized an entire nation's rage and nearly achieved total annihilation. He made the destruction of the assassins look like a side effect of history rather than the primary objective. That's not just strategy, that's art. Horrible, murderous art, but art nonetheless. The Brotherhood eventually recovered, because it always does, but the French chapter never fully regained what it lost during those 5 years. Germain came closer to permanently ending the assassins than almost any Templar before or after him, and he did it without most of the world ever knowing a Templar was involved. But if weaponizing a revolution sounds like the peak of Templar ambition, wait until you meet a man who tried to conquer Italy with a papal army and an ego the size of the Mediterranean. Cesare Borgia. Most Templars have to choose. You get the army or you get the institution. You get the political connections or you get the muscle. Cesare Borgia looked at that choice and laughed, because Cesare had everything. As the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, Cesare was born into the single most powerful institution in the Western world. His father literally controlled the Vatican. And instead of sitting back and enjoying the nepotism like a normal person, Cesare decided to also become Captain General of the Papal Armies in 1498. So now you've got a man with the full religious authority of the Catholic Church backing him and direct command over one of the most formidable military forces in central Italy. That's not a Templar. That's a final boss. And he used every bit of it. Cesare systematically conquered the Romagna region, crushing resistance city by city, eliminating assassin influence wherever he found it. This wasn't some shadowy conspiracy operating through intermediaries. This was open military conquest backed by papal decree. He could brand you a heretic and send an army to your door at the same time, which is, not ideal if you're an assassin trying to operate in Italy. But here's where it gets genuinely scary. Cesare also possessed knowledge of Isu artifacts, including the Vault of Minerva. So on top of the army, on top of the church, on top of the political dynasty, he had access to precursor technology that most Templars would sell their entire bloodline to get their hands on. He was stacking power sources like a kid collecting infinity stones, except every single one of them was real and every single one of them worked. The man wasn't building a regional power base. He was building toward continental domination. His ambitions stretched far beyond Italy, and with the resources he had, there was genuinely no ceiling on how far he could have gone. The Italian Brotherhood wasn't dealing with a local problem. They were staring down a machine that could have swallowed Europe whole. And the proof of how dangerous he was? Look at how long it took to stop him. Ezio Auditore, arguably the greatest assassin who ever lived, spent years dismantling Cesare's network. years. Not a quick infiltration, not a single decisive strike. A sustained, multi-year campaign across the entirety of Italy, peeling back layer after layer of Borgia influence. That's one of the longest operations against a single target in the entire franchise. When it takes the best assassin in history that long to bring you down, you were doing something right. Even outside the games, Cesare's historical reputation is nightmarish. The real Cesare Borgia was known for political assassinations, ruthless military campaigns, and a level of personal ambition that made Machiavelli literally write a book about him. The Prince wasn't fiction. It was a field guide based on watching Cesare operate, so when Ubisoft turned him into a Templar, they barely had to exaggerate. He had the army, he had the church, he had the artifacts, he had the dynasty. No other Templar in the franchise stacked that many pillars of power simultaneously. And it still wasn't enough, because eventually Ezio threw him off the walls of Viana Castle and called it a day. But if you think a man with an army and the Vatican behind him was hard to kill, wait until you meet the Templar who used to be an assassin, and knew exactly where every single one of them was hiding. Shay Patrick Cormac. Every organization's worst nightmare isn't the enemy at the gates. It's the guy who just walked out the back door with every blueprint, every password, and every name on the payroll. That's Shay Patrick Cormac. And the Colonial Brotherhood never recovered from him. Shay wasn't recruited by the Templars through ideology or bribery. He was an assassin, a trained, initiated, fully operational member of the Colonial Brotherhood who knew every safe house location, every dead drop protocol, every cipher the Brotherhood used to communicate across the Atlantic. He knew which floorboards creaked in the hideouts. He knew which harbors the assassins used to move supplies. He knew the faces of every single operative on the eastern seaboard, and then he switched sides. Here's the thing, Shay didn't defect because he was corrupted or because the Templars offered him power. He defected because he genuinely believed the Brotherhood was wrong. During a mission to retrieve a precursor artifact in Lisbon, the site's disturbance triggered a catastrophic earthquake that leveled the city and killed thousands of civilians. Shay watched it happen. He went back to the Brotherhood, told them what happened, and they essentially told him to keep his mouth shut and follow orders, so he didn't. That's what makes him more unsettling than a simple traitor, a traitor you can dismiss. A man acting on genuine moral conviction, that's a problem you can't solve with a hidden blade. Shay looked at the Brotherhood's methods, decided they were reckless, and concluded that the Templars' philosophy of control might actually prevent more suffering than the assassin's philosophy of freedom. You can disagree with him. You can, but you can't call him a sellout. And once he turned, the damage was surgical. Shay personally assassinated at least 7 named assassin targets across North America and beyond, systematically dismantling the Colonial Brotherhood piece by piece. He didn't stumble into these kills. He used Brotherhood tactics against Brotherhood members. He knew how they moved, how they hid, how they thought. Every counter-surveillance technique they'd ever taught him became a weapon pointed back at them. But he wasn't just an attack dog. Shay recruited and trained Templar operatives across North America, building the foundational networks that would sustain the American Templar Order for over a century. He operated with near-total autonomy across massive geographic territories, from the frozen North Atlantic to the colonial frontier, making him essentially impossible to predict or contain. The Brotherhood couldn't set a trap for him because he'd designed half their traps himself. By the time Shay was finished, the Colonial Brotherhood was functionally extinct, not weakened, not diminished, gone. The organization that had operated across the colonies for decades was reduced to scattered individuals with no infrastructure, no leadership, and no safe ground to regroup on. It took Connor Kenway an entire revolution to even begin rebuilding what Shay had destroyed. And that's the real question fans keep coming back to. Did the Brotherhood create their own deadliest enemy? They trained him, they armed him, they showed him everything, and when he raised legitimate concerns about civilian casualties, they dismissed him. Every skill he used to destroy them was a skill they gave him. Every weakness he exploited was a weakness they refused to address. Shay wasn't the most politically powerful Templar on this list. He didn't command armies or control nations. But in terms of pure tactical lethality against the Assassin Brotherhood specifically, nobody else comes close. He is the single most effective assassin hunter the Templar Order ever produced, and he did it all with knowledge the Brotherhood handed him on a silver platter. But if Shay was the blade that gutted the Colonial Brotherhood, the man who picked up the pieces and built something permanent from the wreckage was even more dangerous. And he happened to be the son of an assassin, Haytham Kenway. Every other Templar on this list killed assassins. Haytham Kenway built the machine that would keep killing them for centuries after he was already dead, and that distinction is exactly why he's here at number 1. See, Haytham didn't arrive in the colonies and start swinging a blade around. He arrived with a plan. The American colonies in the 1750s had zero Templar infrastructure, none. No operatives, no networks, no influence. Just raw, unclaimed territory in the middle of a brewing revolution. Haytham looked at that blank canvas and thought, perfect. He personally recruited and mentored operatives across all 13 colonies. Not hired muscle, not disposable agents. Institutional loyalists who understood the Templar philosophy and could embed themselves into the political, military, and economic fabric of a nation that didn't even exist yet. He wasn't building an army, he was building an ideology with legs. And here's where it gets genuinely impressive. While the American Revolution was tearing the colonies apart, Haytham positioned his order on both sides of the conflict. It didn't matter who won the war, because the Templars had influence over the outcome either way. The founding of the United States, the actual birth of a new nation, happened with Templar fingerprints all over it. Not because Haytham fired a shot at Yorktown, but because he'd spent decades making sure the right people owed the right favors to the right order. That's not combat, that's chess. But the real gut punch of Haytham's story isn't political, it's personal. His own son Connor became an assassin. Not just any assassin, but the one who would eventually kill him. Father and son standing on opposite sides of a war that neither of them started, both absolutely convinced they were right. Connor drove his blade into Haytham during the revolution, and for a brief moment, it felt like the Brotherhood had won. They hadn't, because Haytham's colonial Templar order survived his death. It survived Connor's entire campaign against it. It survived the 18th century, bled into the 19th, and continued threatening the Brotherhood long after both Haytham and Connor were buried in the ground. His institutional framework outlasted every single person who tried to destroy it. Connor killed his father and still couldn't kill what his father built. That's not a defeat, that's a legacy. And this is what makes the fan debate around Assassin's Creed 3 so fascinating. A huge portion of the community genuinely believes Haytham was the true protagonist. You play as him for the opening hours, you understand his logic, you see his methods, and when the game forces you to switch to Connor and oppose everything Haytham built, a lot of players felt like they were fighting for the wrong side. Haytham's ideology wasn't cartoonish villainy, it was order, structure, control. He looked at the chaos of revolution and said, people need guidance, not freedom they can't handle. And honestly, the game never fully proves him wrong. That's the scariest thing about Haytham Kenway. He wasn't a monster, he was a strategist who believed completely in what he was doing, built something that no single assassin could tear down, and died knowing it would outlast him. Other Templars on this list fought battles. Haytham won a war, not with a hidden blade or a piece of Eden, but with patience, recruitment, and the understanding that true power isn't what you can destroy, it's what you can build that nobody else can. His shadow is the longest any Templar ever cast, and the Brotherhood spent generations trying to step out of it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.